Now let's turn our attention from the mysterious world of dreams to something just as curious, the medieval practice of interpreting nighttime omens. In a time when the world was full of uncertainty, people were on high alert for signs of divine favor or impending doom. And many believed that the answers to their questions could be found in the oddities of the night. From strange noises outside the window to the way a cat stared at the moon, medieval Europe was a place where nothing was left to chance, especially after dark. Omen interpretations was a serious business. Much like dream interpretation, omens were considered messages sent by higher powers, be they gods, angels, or even the souls of the departed. It wasn't unusual for a local priest to be consulted if someone experienced an unusual sound, a vision in the dark, or something that could be considered an omen. People took these occurrences seriously, sometimes believing they were being given divine instruction about how to proceed with an important life decision. One could imagine a farmer hearing the ominous call of an owl and suddenly deciding to postpone planting crops for fear of bad luck. Or a merchant observing the way the wind shifted at night and deciding to delay a trip. One of the more famous omens in medieval folklore involved the appearance of certain creatures at night, especially birds. The owl, for example, was often linked to death and misfortune. If an owl hooted 3 times during the night, it was believed to signal the death of someone in the community, especially if the hoots came from the direction of the deceased's home. Similarly, the raven, with its dark and mysterious nature, was often seen as a harbinger of disaster. But not all omens were tied to the death of loved ones. Some birds were believed to bring messages of hope. A nightingale singing in the darkness was considered a sign of hope and joy, a glimpse of beauty in the otherwise dark world. It wasn't just animals that were watched for omens, though. Even the sounds of the night itself were analyzed for meaning. A knock on the door in the middle of the night might be seen as a warning that an unwanted visitor was about to arrive, or that something bad was about to happen. The sound of church bells ringing at odd hours could signal that a great event, such as a royal birth or a death, was soon to occur. The howling of dogs in the night was seen as a warning of danger or even a supernatural presence nearby. In fact, people were so attuned to the sounds of the night that they could often interpret them without even fully understanding why. In the midst of all this uncertainty, medieval people also turned to the stars for guidance. Many believed that the alignment of the heavens at night could reveal hidden truths about the world around them. Astrology was seen as an essential tool for understanding everything from the state of one's health to the future of one's crops. The positions of the stars were consulted not only for their practical applications, but also for the omens they might offer. A sudden shift in the constellations or a rare celestial event like a comet or an eclipse could spark intense speculation about the future. These events were often thought to signal major shifts in the world, perhaps the rise or fall of empires, or the arrival of great leaders or conquerors. Historians still debate how much of this nocturnal superstition was rooted in actual events, or if it was merely a reflection of people's deep need for control in an unpredictable world. The medieval mind, it seems, was always searching for meaning, especially at night, when the boundaries between the physical and spiritual realms felt most blurred. The mysticism of the night wasn't just about omens, but about seeing the unseen. It was about trying to understand the forces that were believed to govern the world, many of which could not be seen during the day. Some might argue that these nighttime omens were simply psychological responses to the uncertainty and dangers of medieval life. In a time when plagues, war, and famine loomed large, it's understandable that people would look to any available source for meaning. Was the sight of a black cat a sign of witchcraft? Or was it just a cat doing what cats do? Was that howling wolf a signal of an impending raid? Or was it just an animal being an animal? The answer, of course, is never entirely clear. It's worth noting that these superstitions didn't just vanish as time went on. As you lie in bed tonight, the world around you may seem calm and orderly, but there are still traces of these medieval fears and beliefs in modern culture. People still talk about bad omens, or believe that certain events, like breaking a mirror or walking under a ladder, might bring misfortune. These beliefs, though less intense, linger in the collective psyche, perhaps as a distant echo of a time when the night was full of mystery and danger. As we continue, we'll move on to another peculiar habit of medieval nights: the midnight feasts. Yes, these were not just any late-night snacks. These feasts were shrouded in ritual, mystery, and sometimes even a touch of the macabre. So, let's dig into the strange and unexpected world of medieval midnight indulgence. As we drift into the next peculiar practice of medieval nights, let's talk about the curious and somewhat gluttonous tradition of the midnight feasts. Imagine this. You've just finished a long day of labor, the kind of exhausting work that medieval people were all too familiar with. And the day has drawn to a close. But instead of retreating to bed for much-needed rest, many medieval folk would indulge in a strange ritual, a feast deep in the night. These were not your average meals. Midnight feasts were often reserved for special occasions, festivals, significant feasts like Christmas or Easter, or the more subtle reasons, a feeling of camaraderie, or the need to celebrate surviving yet another day. The more exciting detail about these feasts is that they were not necessarily about sustenance. They were about celebration. People would gather in secret, often in a corner of a nobleman's grand hall or within the safety of a peasant's humble home. These late-night gatherings were typically a social event involving loud chatter, deep laughter, and plenty of food to go around. The real fun happened under the cover of darkness, when social norms took a back seat and rules were forgotten. Interestingly, the foods served at these feasts were often unconventional and sometimes extravagant. Meat, often roasted pig, venison, or game birds, was the centerpiece of the meal. But it was not only about the rich dishes. The feast's true delight often came from strange and unexpected food pairings. Things like pickled herring with sweet bread, or spiced wine paired with preserved fruits. The unusual combinations and the overabundance of food were meant to keep the spirits high and the guests in a state of indulgence. Historians still debate whether these midnight feasts were meant to celebrate the wealth and abundance of medieval society, or whether they were simply a way for people to forget the harshness of daily life. Some even speculate that these feasts were held as a form of rebellion, particularly among the lower classes. The idea of eating lavishly in the dead of night, without concern for the expected standards of behavior, could be a quiet form of resistance, a small but significant way to feel some control in a world that often felt out of one's hands. But the ritualistic nature of these feasts shouldn't be overlooked. Like many medieval traditions, there was a sense that such events were tied to the spiritual world. You could often find symbols of fertility, such as eggs or fruits, on the tables of these feasts, connecting the meal to ideas of renewal and growth. Some feasts even had rituals attached to them, perhaps a toast to the health of the monarch, or a shared prayer for prosperity. At the time, Many believed that the food consumed during these late-night feasts could somehow influence their fortune for the coming year. The feasts weren't just about food. There was a sense of mysticism in the air, especially when it came to the consumption of alcohol. Medieval mead or ale flowed freely, and drinking, it was believed, could bring people closer to the divine. Perhaps the most interesting and somewhat alarming belief around the midnight feasts was that the alcohol consumed during these gatherings had the potential to invite spirits from the other side. Spirituality and superstition were ever present in the lives of the medieval folk, and what better way to embrace the unknown than to share a midnight drink with friends? The ghosts of the past, if you will, were always just a glass away. The most fascinating aspect of these feasts, however, may be the idea that, in the absence of daylight, people could experience a temporary release from their social roles. Think about it. At night, when the world seemed quieter, the pressure to conform lessened, and individuals could be free from the constraints of the day. The rich could socialize with the poor, and the young could mingle with the old. In this twilight zone, things could happen that never would have been allowed during the daylight hours. The feasts became a space for unpredictable alliances, even a space for intimate romantic liaisons. No one would be none the wiser come morning. As we begin to ease into the final thoughts for tonight, take a moment to reflect on how different things were back then. What's remarkable about these midnight feasts is not just the food or the drink, but the feeling of being alive in a time when you could revel in something so human, the need to enjoy life, even when the sun had long gone to bed. So, as you let your eyelids flutter heavier with each passing minute, imagine those medieval feasts carried on late into the night. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the merry voices blending into the shadows. And as you settle deeper into your own comfort tonight, let that sense of abandon ease your mind. Hey guys, tonight we're going to embark on a journey into the quiet, shadowed corners of medieval Europe, where the night wasn't just a time for rest. It was a time for strange, and sometimes even eerie, habits. Picture it. The clock strikes 2 a.m., the streets are empty, and the gentle flicker of candlelight is the only sign of life. The town is hushed, and everything comes to a standstill. Why was this hour, the dreaded 2 a.m. curfew, so critical? Well, this wasn't some arbitrary rule, and it wasn't all about getting a good night's rest. In fact, it was a lot more complex than we might think. So settle in, because tonight, we're going to uncover the strange, quiet rituals that governed the medieval night. You're probably wondering, why 2 a.m.? Couldn't it just have been midnight or 3 a.m. or even some other time? Well, it turns out that this curfew was more about control than comfort. Medieval cities were nothing like the bustling urban centers of today. They were smaller, quieter, and more prone to the sort of chaos that could erupt when people weren't properly tucked in. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to know where you're joining from tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. To truly understand the 2 a.m. curfew, you need to picture medieval towns as small, almost fragile places. The streets were narrow, the buildings crowded, and the night, well, it was a different world entirely. Once the sun dipped below the horizon, darkness ruled, and not in a cozy, sleepy time kind of way. No, the medieval night was a realm of danger, superstition, and order. Without the protection of modern street lights, it was easy for things to go wrong when the town was left to its own devices. Now, let's think about the importance of 2 a.m. The time when, no matter what was happening in the town, everything came to an abrupt halt. The curfew wasn't just a matter of getting some much-needed rest after a long day's work. It was about control. Control over the people, control over what happened at night, and even control over what you could do in your own home. Historians still debate whether the curfew's true purpose was to maintain order or to simply ensure that the ruling class had the upper hand over the lives of the lower classes. But one thing's for certain. By 2 a.m., everything had to be in its place. Imagine yourself as a medieval resident, walking through the town streets around midnight. The taverns are still open, the last few traders are packing up their wares, and people are heading home after a long night of revelry. But when the clock strikes 2, the world shifts. The town falls silent. People hustle home, tavern doors close, and only the most necessary workers remain. Those who are keeping the peace, ensuring that nothing sinister could creep into the quiet of the night. You wouldn't be surprised if you heard a few whispers about ghostly figures or creatures that roamed in the darkness. But that was just part of the atmosphere. The real reason for the curfew, though, was far more practical. For the elites and the city's leaders, the curfew meant a tight grip on the pulse of the town. After all, the streets weren't just places to walk. They were often where disputes, crimes, and unsavory activities occurred. If you were a member of the medieval aristocracy, you would want the streets clear of potential chaos after dark. No surprise brawls, no crimes of opportunity. Everything and everyone had to be tucked away under lock and key. It was easier to manage a city when it was mostly quiet, and when people were asleep, they weren't causing trouble. But of course, there were always the night owls, the people who defied the curfew, those who worked the night shift, the midnight watchmen, and yes, even the occasional thief. The watchman, who had a very particular job to do, often walked the streets after the curfew had been enforced. It was their job to ensure that no one was out of line, to make sure the law was followed. But as you might imagine, it wasn't just about watching people. The medieval watchman had an entirely different set of rules to follow, rules that were as strange and mysterious as the town itself. As you settle deeper into your blanket, imagine the quiet footsteps of the medieval watchman, creeping through the darkened streets of the town. They were a necessary part of this nighttime order, but their role was much more complex than just watching the streets. These night patrols were often made up of ordinary townsfolk who had been conscripted into service. Yes, they were tasked with keeping the peace, but they also had to handle all sorts of oddities that came with the strange hours. After all, when the rest of the town was fast asleep, the watchmen would often encounter more than just drunks and petty thieves. The role of the night watchman is one of the oddest and most misunderstood jobs in medieval society. They weren't just the protectors of the streets, but also the enforcers of one of the most curious laws of the night, the curfew. In the dead of night, when most people were tucked safely into bed, the watchmen would patrol the streets with their lanterns and bells, making sure that everything remained under control. But there was more to their job than simply following a set of rules. They had to deal with everything from minor infractions to unsettling supernatural occurrences. This role was essential to maintaining order, but let's just say, it wasn't always glamorous. Historians still argue whether the night watchmen were respected figures, or more like a medieval version of neighborhood snitches. Their job was to ensure no one was breaking curfew. But it also meant they were the first to report anything strange or suspicious happening in the dark. If you were caught outside after 2 a.m., you were risking more than just a fine. You were risking a confrontation with a watchman who could report you to the local authorities. And if you were a noble, well, let's just say your social status could sometimes let you slip past these rules with a little consequence. But if you were an ordinary peasant or artisan, you would be facing a much harsher penalty. It wasn't uncommon for people to be locked up for the night, or worse, fined a hefty amount for breaking curfew. What's even more fascinating is the strange ways in which people tried to avoid the curfew. Some people built hidden passageways or underground tunnels to slip in and out of town unnoticed. Others would bribe the watchman to turn a blind eye, although this wasn't always a guaranteed strategy. These underground movements weren't just for criminals or thieves, but also for the merchants who worked at night. Medieval cities had bustling markets that ran until late hours, and the workers in those markets often needed to sneak in and out after curfew. These secretive operations were a matter of necessity for some, but were also an exciting part of the social fabric of the time. Of course, the night watchmen weren't the only ones trying to keep the streets clear. Cities also employed special officers known as beadles to help enforce the curfew. These beadles had the specific duty of going from house to house, ensuring that the curfew was followed. They were often the ones to knock on doors, reminding families to stay indoors and lock up for the night. It wasn't a job that many people wanted, but it was one that had to be done. Beadles were typically chosen for their strictness and their willingness to uphold the law. But they were also responsible for dealing with any disturbances in the night, such as noise complaints or even disputes between neighbors. Now, you might be wondering, what was so dangerous about the night that it required this much attention? Why not just let people stay out and enjoy themselves after dark? Well, for medieval towns, nighttime was a different world entirely. It was full of dangers, both human and supernatural. With no streetlights and minimal security, the night was often a time for mischief, violence, and crime. Criminals could hide in the shadows, plotting their next move, and thieves could strike when the town was at its most vulnerable. Even more unsettling were the superstitions that prevailed at the time. The medieval world was steeped in belief in the supernatural, and many people thought that strange creatures roamed the streets at night. Ghosts, goblins, and demons were believed to be particularly active during the witching hour, around 2 a.m. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly believed in these creatures, or whether it was just a fear-based strategy to keep people indoors at night. But whatever the reason, this belief in the supernatural added another layer of anxiety to the already oppressive nighttime curfew. People not only had to worry about criminals, but also about what might be lurking in the shadows. And while there's no concrete evidence to suggest that supernatural creatures were ever a real threat, the fear of them was very real. For centuries, this fear was deeply ingrained in the culture, leading to various rituals and practices designed to protect people from the unknown. So, as you drift deeper into sleep, imagine the watchmen patrolling the dark streets, the beadles knocking on doors, and the ever-present sense of unease that filled the night. The 2 a.m. curfew wasn't just about getting rest. It was about keeping the world outside the walls safe and sound. But what really lay beyond those walls? What were people truly afraid of when the town went to sleep? We'll explore that a bit further as we move along tonight's journey. As the quiet of the medieval town settled in and the moon reached its zenith, the curfew bell's echo reverberated through the streets. The curfew wasn't simply an inconvenience. It was a reflection of how people viewed time itself. Time was segmented into rigid blocks, each associated with duties, fears, and customs that might seem utterly alien to us today. But as you drift into this strange world, it becomes clearer that medieval people viewed the night not just as a time for sleep, but as a necessary pause, a boundary between the safety of day and the potential chaos of the night. At around 2 a.m., it wasn't just the watchmen keeping an eye on the town's integrity. It was also the religious authorities, keeping an eye on everyone's soul. The medieval church had a rather peculiar attitude towards sleep. You see, sleep, in the church's eyes, wasn't just about physical rest. It was a moment of spiritual reckoning. Monks, in particular, believed that sleep was when your soul was most vulnerable. The idea was that while you slept, demons could more easily possess you, leading you to sinful dreams or tempting you into sinful actions. Historians still argue whether the church truly believed in these supernatural threats or whether it was simply a way to maintain control over people's daily lives. Whatever the case, religious orders took sleep very seriously. Many monasteries had strict schedules that dictated when the monks should rise for prayer or meditation, often in the dead of night, long before the sun's first light. This was a time when even the most devout individuals had to be wary of slipping into spiritual sloth or indulgence. So these nighttime prayers weren't just about devotion. They were also seen as a defense against the dark forces that supposedly lurked just beyond the reach of the candlelight. But let's not forget that the rest of society, those not living in monasteries or under the watchful eyes of priests, also had a strange relationship with sleep. For ordinary townspeople, sleep was something of a privilege. It wasn't guaranteed that everyone had a warm bed or a peaceful night. The wealthy might have cozy, well-lit rooms, but the poor often slept on floors or in drafty buildings. Their rest was far more restless, and sleep patterns were dictated by the rhythms of work, social duties, and survival. You might sleep at night, but your sleep wasn't necessarily continuous. Many people practiced what was known as biphasic sleep. Biphasic sleep was a normal part of medieval life. People often slept in two distinct blocks, with a wakeful period in the middle of the night. It was common for people to sleep for a few hours after dusk, wake up around 2 a.m., and then spend an hour or so doing something productive, or perhaps, more often, enjoying a bit of social time. They might have a small meal, converse with family members, or engage in other quiet activities. But what's most fascinating is that this waking time was often associated with some form of spiritual contemplation or prayer. The church believed this was a time when the veil between the spiritual and the earthly worlds was thinnest, and so many would rise for prayers or to reflect on their day. Some people even found it the perfect opportunity for a secret meeting or a quiet moment to themselves away from the prying eyes of children or spouses. Historians still argue whether biphasic sleep was a necessity for survival in medieval times, or whether it was an extension of deeply held spiritual practices. It seems like the natural rhythms of life, working during the day, engaging with family, then waking in the middle of the night, created an environment in which these fragmented sleep cycles were just as normal as today's uninterrupted slumber. But the more we look at it, the more we see that medieval society wasn't simply about surviving. It was about navigating time itself. And so, as you lie here, tucked under your covers, let the idea of these two distinct sleep periods wash over you. Now, Consider the kinds of activities that might have filled these midnight hours. If you were a commoner in the medieval period, your evening might have been occupied by any number of quiet tasks, maybe weaving, mending clothes, or finishing the day's chores. But these midnight hours weren't only about work. They were also about tending to your spiritual self. You would have said a prayer, perhaps reflected on your day, or listened to a story told in the soft glow of a candle. And as you drift into deeper sleep, think about the unusual way these fragmented hours were connected to both the mundane and the mystical, as people sought a balance between daily survival and spiritual harmony. The church, with all its rituals and restrictions, wasn't the only force shaping medieval sleep. The rising fear of witches and the supernatural also began to surface in these early hours. Midnight was considered the most dangerous time to be alone. Witches, it was believed, operated at this hour, and many communities developed elaborate rituals to keep themselves safe. You might have sprinkled salt around your bed, hung protective charms, or even used garlic to ward off any perceived threat. These practices were rooted in superstition, but they also spoke to the deeper unease medieval people felt when darkness fell. In the medieval mind, night was a time of dualities, both mundane and magical, both feared and revered. As you lie here, you might imagine the chill of the night air, the quiet creaking of the floorboards, and the strange, mysterious rituals that unfolded in the shadows. This was the world of medieval sleep, a time where not even rest was entirely safe. As the 2 a.m. hour passed, the medieval world shifted. If you were fortunate enough to be in the warmth of your home, you would have been nestled between heavy blankets, the light of a lone candle casting flickering shadows on the walls. Yet, even with the quiet of the night surrounding you, you would have felt the presence of the unknown. In medieval Europe, time wasn't just about the ticking of the clock. It was defined by invisible forces and deeply ingrained traditions. And around this time, as the moon hung high and the stars blinked quietly in the sky, the very nature of time seemed to bend. For many, the night wasn't simply a time to sleep. It was a time to understand and confront the mysteries of the world. And in medieval Europe, one of the most curious things about these dark hours was how they intersected with the perception of disease. People believed that illnesses didn't just spread through physical contact. They were carried by unseen forces, often attributed to supernatural causes. As the church became more entrenched in daily life, the association between sickness and spiritual punishment became more pronounced. Historians still argue whether medieval disease outbreaks were solely tied to superstitions, or whether they were more about ignorance of hygiene and the actual science of disease. Regardless, at night, the idea of pestilence was a shadow that loomed over everyone. If you awoke during your midnight waking hours, the feeling of being watched or the presence of something out unseen wasn't just folklore. It was the reality of medieval thinking. You could have felt a sickness creeping over you even if you were perfectly healthy. The world was filled with invisible dangers, and the 2 a.m. hours were believed to be particularly ripe for encountering them. But let's zoom in on a particularly bizarre concept from this time: the belief in the night air. It was thought that the air after midnight was thick with disease, malevolent spirits, and mystical forces. This strange idea led to some odd practices. For example, medieval people believed that if you ventured outside after the witching hour, you would expose yourself to various misfortunes. A common cure for this contaminated air was a little bit of good old superstition. If you tied a piece of iron around your wrist, you could ward off any potential harm. Iron, of course, was considered a magical substance during the medieval period, able to protect you from the forces lurking in the darkness. While some of these ideas might sound laughable today, they were rooted in a culture deeply embedded in mysticism, fear, and a lack of understanding about the natural world. The concept of the night air wasn't just about protecting yourself from sickness. It was about protecting your soul. In this time, the physical and spiritual realms were intertwined in ways we can hardly fathom now. Your body might have been in bed, but your soul was out in the cold night air, exposed to whatever threats were lurking just beyond your doorstep. In fact, many people during the medieval period also believed in night sickness, a condition that supposedly caused people to wake up feeling unwell, dizzy, or disoriented. It wasn't just physical symptoms. They believed that your soul was being attacked by demons or witches, as they saw this ailment as being tied to the supernatural. A common remedy involved placing protective herbs around the house, including rosemary and thyme, or even burning them during the night to cleanse the air. At the same time, while some were frightened of the night air and its malevolent influence, there were others who welcomed the quiet solitude of the late hours. If you weren't worried about the supernatural forces at play, you might have found a sense of peace in the serenity of night. Imagine being a monk, for instance, who is tasked with rising at these ungodly hours for prayer. To them, the night was sacred, and they cherished the stillness it provided. As you sleep, you might find yourself wondering whether the monks saw the night as a time for connecting with God, or if they too sometimes struggled with the same fears of darkness that plagued the rest of society. Then, of course, there were the stories. You can't overlook the tales of supernatural creatures that were whispered in hushed voices during the late night hours. Werewolves, vampires, and other mythical beasts were staples of medieval folklore. The belief in these creatures was so widespread that they even found their way in the religious texts of the time. In fact, some medieval theologians wrote extensively about the dangers of encountering these creatures during the night. It was believed that werewolves were most active under the full moon, and encountering one could lead to a horrible fate. Historians still debate whether these creatures were simply figments of overactive imaginations, or whether there might have been real-life explanations for these beliefs. Perhaps there were people who suffered from conditions that caused them to behave strangely during the night. Or maybe the fear of the unknown created a fertile ground for these legends to thrive. But one thing was certain. The fear of the night and its mysterious creatures was very real in medieval Europe. As you settled deeper into your sleep, you might feel the cool night air brushing across your face, and perhaps, just for a moment, wonder about the people of medieval Europe who lived their lives in constant awareness of the darkness that surrounded them. The 2 a.m. hour was not just the end of a long day for them. It was a time of spiritual reckoning, superstitions, and strange rituals designed to protect them from the invisible forces that they believed existed in the world around them. And though they may have gone to sleep each night with a prayer or protective charm in hand, the night itself remained a mystery, always threatening to reveal something new. The 2 a.m. hours had another curious characteristic in medieval Europe. It was a time for the working class to sneak in a little rest, often against the will of their employers or society's expectations. Imagine being a farmer, Onorden, laboring in the fields by day and struggling to catch some sleep at night. In the middle of the night, when the moon was high and the stars were shimmering above, there was a quiet and subtle rebellion taking place. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but for some, those precious moments between midnight and dawn were their only time of quietude and rest. The custom of taking a break in the middle of the night, often referred to as the first sleep, was once common. During this period, people would sleep for a few hours after dark, then wake up around midnight. This was the time for contemplation, prayer, and even socializing in some cases. You could have found yourself lying in bed, listening to the distant sounds of the night. Dogs barking, the creak of the wind, and perhaps the faintest hum of conversation from the room next door. You might have noticed how peaceful it felt to be awake in those early hours, when the world seemed to be holding its breath. Historians still argue whether the practice of segmented sleep, taking a break in the middle of the night, was truly a cultural norm, or whether it was just the way people adapted to the demands of medieval life. What is certain, however, is that people often didn't have the luxury of an uninterrupted night's sleep like we do today. They were more attuned to the rhythms of their bodies and the natural world around them. So, after the first sleep, many would wake up for a second round of sleep, often only to rise again for their day's work at dawn. The medieval world didn't have the conveniences of electric lighting or central heating, so the natural world and its cycles governed much of life. The idea of waking up during the night was far from strange. It was a necessary practice in the medieval period. People would often use this break to do things they didn't have time for during the day. You might have gone for a midnight walk to clear your mind, or perhaps visited the local tavern for a quiet drink with friends or fellow villagers. Some would take the time to engage in more intimate activities, often involving storytelling, song, or quiet moments with their loved ones. People even believed that the middle of the night was a time when the veil between this world and the next was thin, so it wasn't unusual for some to pray or engage in mystical practices to connect with the supernatural during their midnight wakefulness. But even in these quieter, more introspective moments, there was still a persistent awareness of the dangers that could emerge from the darkness. Many medieval folks, while awake during the night, had a lingering sense that something might be lurking just beyond their vision. This feeling of paranoia wasn't just about potential threats from thieves or the political unrest of the time. It also had spiritual overtones. A sense of unease pervaded the air at this hour, and it wasn't uncommon for people to speak in whispers, as though the act of saying something aloud might provoke the wrath of unseen forces. In fact, some medieval texts and stories claim that people who slept soundly through the night without waking for the first or second sleep were thought to be somehow unspiritual or disconnected from the divine. There was a belief that if you didn't wake up in the middle of the night for prayer, you might be falling victim to the influence of demons. The idea was that sleep, particularly at these strange hours, was a means of spiritual connection or protection. If you skipped it, you were essentially ignoring your spiritual duties, leaving yourself vulnerable to malevolent forces. On a more mundane level, this practice of segmented sleep also had some practical implications. People in the medieval period, especially those living in cities, had a more flexible view of time. Their schedules were determined by external factors, mostly the sun, the seasons, and the demands of the land. It wasn't uncommon for people to adjust their rest patterns to accommodate their surroundings. If you were a blacksmith, a weaver, or a farmer, Your workday often didn't follow a strict 9 to 5 schedule. You worked when the work needed to be done, and sometimes that meant taking a break during the night. You could have found yourself waking up to check on your animals, stoke the fire, or simply reflect on the day's tasks. But what was the societal view on this? Were people ever penalized for taking that midnight break? Or did society, in general, accept this practice as a natural part of the rhythm of life? It's difficult to say for sure. What we do know is that, much like the belief in the supernatural forces at play during the midnight hour, the practices surrounding sleep in medieval Europe were far more fluid and pragmatic than we might expect. It was common for people to get their rest in short bursts, piecing together sleep in ways that fit the demands of their environment. Some would even sleep for several hours, wake up for an hour or two, then return to bed for a second sleep. It was an entirely different rhythm than the one we're used to today. And it reflected a time when life was far less structural. Instead of being ruled by the ticking of a clock or the chirping of an alarm, people lived more in tune with the world around them. This break between the two sleeps could have been a time for deep reflection, quiet thought, or even simple rest. During the medieval period, sleep wasn't just about recharging for the day ahead. It was an opportunity to retreat into a different state of consciousness, a place where the boundaries between the waking world and the world of dreams began to blur. In the stillness of the night, anything seemed possible, and the lines between the physical and spiritual worlds were drawn ever so thin. And as you drift off into sleep tonight, you might find yourself wondering what it would have been like to live in an age where the night held so much more mystery and meaning, where the practice of taking a break in the middle of the night to simply wake up and reflect was as common as the act of falling asleep itself. Perhaps, like the medieval people, you too can find solace in the quiet moments that come with waking in the night, embracing the stillness and allowing your mind to wander. In the medieval period, the night wasn't just a time for sleep. It was also an essential part of the community fabric, often serving as a time for various rituals, both religious and social. While the first sleep was a break for rest, the second sleep was often the time when people engaged in activities meant to connect them with their faith, their neighbors, or even the spiritual realm itself. As we move through the quiet hours of the night, let's consider how the medieval folk viewed this strange period and how it shaped their cultural and spiritual practices. The medieval Christian world, for instance, was steeped in religious observances that affected daily life in profound ways. The hours between the two sleeps were often filled with midnight prayers, known as matins, a major part of the monastic liturgy. Those living in or near monasteries would have been well acquainted with the sounds of monks chanting their prayers in the dead of night, a practice designed not just for spiritual devotion, but also to mark time and structure the night in ways we would consider unusual today. The idea behind this late-night prayer wasn't just to honor God, but to reflect on the spiritual state of the soul and the world. In a sense, the midnight hour became a boundary time, a crossing between the earthly realm and the divine. You could imagine the air growing cool as midnight approached, the wind rustling through the trees, the light flickering on the candles as the chant echoed through the stone walls of the abbey or the chapel. For the peasants and townsfolk, it might have been a more humble version of these devotions. There were no grand stone structures for the average villager. Instead, Their prayers might have been whispered by candlelight in a small room, or even outside, under the vast expanse of the starry sky. Historians still argue whether these practices were actually embraced by the general population, or whether they were primarily the domain of the monastic and religious elite. What is clear is that the night was deeply entwined with spiritual life. There was a belief that the night, with its darkness and quiet, was the time when one's soul could be most vulnerable to spiritual attack. The idea of waking up in the middle of the night for prayer or reflection was more than just a break in sleep. It was a defense against the creeping presence of evil, the whispers of demons, and the fear of being unprepared for the afterlife. At the same time, the midnight break was also an opportunity for people to bond socially. Imagine living in a small medieval village where your neighbors were both your family and your community. The hours between the first and second sleep might have been used to gather with close friends or family members, telling stories, singing songs, or even sharing gossip. Some accounts suggest that it wasn't uncommon for medieval people to have midnight meals. Simple affairs, often made up of bread, cheese, and ale, as they sat around the fire, talking of anything that might have happened during the day. This tradition wasn't just confined to rural villages. Even in larger towns and cities, where life was more regimented, people would sometimes gather in the stillness of the night. Of course, in these more urban environments, the midnight hour might have had an entirely different tone, with the sounds of city life never far off. The clanging of blacksmiths, the rumble of carts on cobbled streets. The night was never fully silent. But within the homes of the working class, there was still this sense of connection that was formed during the pause between the two sleeps. Interestingly, in some cultures, the break in sleep was not just a time for private reflection or communal socializing. It was also a time to attend to physical health. People who lived in medieval times didn't have the same access to health care that we do today, so that they had to be more resourceful. Some people might have used the midnight hour for healing rituals, perhaps a bath in warm water infused with herbs to soothe aching muscles, or the use of potions and concoctions passed down through generations. These midnight moments could also have been a time when people tended to minor ailments or wounds that needed attention before the morning light arrived. But then, there was also the belief that the hours between the two sleeps were a time of heightened sensitivity to the supernatural. You may have heard stories passed down from those days about strange, eerie happenings during these hours. The way the wind would sometimes carry an otherworldly sound, or the way shadows seemed to move without explanation. Folk tales about spirits visiting during this quiet time of the night were common. Whether it was a ghostly apparition of a long-dead relative, a mischievous spirit causing havoc, or the dreaded nightmare creatures of the medieval mind, the line between the real and the imagined seemed to blur during these hours. Despite this fear of the unknown, it wasn't always a time of dread. For some, these midnight breaks offered a rare opportunity to experience the world in a way that felt disconnected from the hustle and bustle of daily life. The air was often colder during these hours, which added a certain sense of clarity to the thoughts and reflections of those awake at the time. You could imagine stepping outside into the cool night, breathing in the crisp air, and looking up at the star-filled sky. For a brief moment, the whole world seemed quiet and still. An atmosphere perfect for deep thoughts, spiritual contemplation, or just the simple act of being alone in the world. And of course, There was also the more mystical side of this practice. In medieval Europe, many believed that the night hours were when the veil between the physical world and the spirit world grew thin. There was a rich tradition of folklore that involved these nighttime spirits, some helpful, others mischievous, and some downright terrifying. Some communities even had customs designed to protect themselves from these otherworldly visits, such as placing herbs or charms by their beds, or lighting special candles to ward off malevolent forces. These superstitions were deeply rooted in the medieval understanding of the world. With so many mysteries surrounding the world at large, especially in the absence of modern science, people had to make sense of the world in ways that connected their experiences with spiritual or supernatural explanations. These midnight rituals and customs were a reflection of this need to seek protection, guidance, and meaning during the hours when the world felt at its most mysterious. By now, the idea of waking up in the middle of the night might seem quaint or even archaic to us. But in the context of medieval Europe, it was a practice steeped in deep cultural, spiritual, and social significance. It wasn't simply about sleep. It was about a time to pause, reflect, and connect with both the world around you and the unseen forces that people believed influenced their lives. As we continue through the still, silent night of medieval Europe, we begin to delve deeper into the peculiarities of the second sleep. It wasn't just a simple interruption of rest. It was a time for the body and mind to reset in a way that might seem alien to us today. Yet, the medieval approach to sleep was not merely functional. It was deeply entwined with the rhythms of the seasons, the moon, and even the natural world itself. As you lie there, eyes closed, imagine yourself waking in the middle of the night, surrounded by a hushed, dark landscape, where every sound feels magnified in the stillness. The medieval understanding of sleep was based on a much more fluid concept than our modern view. For example, they saw sleep as a series of stages, rather than just one long block of unconsciousness. The first sleep, lasting a few hours, was often followed by a brief period of wakefulness before the second sleep took over. This in-between time was used to engage in all sorts of activities, from reading and writing to more intimate or communal moments. It wasn't uncommon for people to pray during this break in sleep, as it was seen as an opportunity for spiritual reflection or a time to confess sins before returning to bed for the second sleep. Historians still argue about the exact nature of this second sleep. Was it something universal across medieval Europe? Or was it just a quirky regional habit? What's clear, however, is that this second sleep wasn't limited to religious activity. There's also evidence that some used this time to socialize, perhaps even with a meal or a drink. In a way, this ritualized pause was not just about sleep. It was a time to reset your mind, to prepare for the second phase of your night, and to reconnect with the people and world around you. To get a sense of how deeply ingrained this practice was, picture yourself as a medieval peasant living in a small cottage with your family. The warmth of the fire crackles in the hearth, and the low murmurs of conversation fill the room as the night stretches on. This moment in the night is not simply about passing time. It's a part of the rhythm of life itself. The break between the first and second sleep could be as quiet and intimate as a shared meal, or as active as taking care of small household chores. But regardless of what you did, this interlude was a break from the mundane and a time to process the day before continuing on into the second sleep. Interestingly, some of the activities done during the wakeful hours of the night seem almost modern in their simplicity. People would engage in quiet reflection, write letters or records, or even stitch and sew. Imagine the soft sounds of needle threading through cloth, the gentle rhythm of a task that connects you to the past while you wait for sleep to claim you again. These were the activities that marked the medieval night as a time for reflection and productivity, even though we now associate the night with rest and recovery. This period was also considered a time for dreams, where the mind could wander and the boundaries between reality and the spiritual world seemed to blur. There were various superstitions tied to these dreams, the most common being that dreams during this second sleep were more prophetic, more meaningful than those of the first. Some medieval people believed that the time between sleeps was when the soul could most freely visit other realms, whether that was the afterlife or some mythical place in the heavens. These dreams were often linked with omens or signs. A dream of a strange figure in the night might indicate an approaching storm, or a visit from a dead relative could be a warning of an impending illness. Historians debate whether these nocturnal beliefs were universally held across medieval Europe, or whether they were confined to specific regions or cultures. What remains undeniable, however, is that the second sleep created an environment ripe for these kinds of spiritual and supernatural interpretations. But of course, not everyone could afford to take a break from the usual routine in the middle of the night. The majority of medieval people had to rise early to work on farms, in mills, or in other trades. For these laborers, the hours between the first and second sleep were likely more about catching up on essential tasks or even tending to their livestock. The medieval economy was largely agrarian, and the cycle of planting, harvesting, and caring for animals demanded long hours that didn't fit neatly into the modern workday. For these workers, the second sleep might have been an even rarer luxury, reserved for the well-to-do or those with less strenuous work. Even so, for the few who could indulge in the comfort of a second sleep, it was a treasured respite. A break between the struggles of the day and the renewed energy of the following morning. As you imagine yourself drifting back to sleep after that moment of wakefulness, picture the comfort of your bed, the quietness of the room, and the peaceful weight of your body as it sinks back into the soft embrace of sleep. There's something deeply human about this experience, this ability to reset and recharge, even in the midst of a long night. Historians still debate the long-term impact this second sleep had on people's health, while many scholars argue that the interruption of sleep may have been detrimental to the body's natural rhythms. Others suggest that it could have been more natural than the continuous, uninterrupted sleep we strive for today. After all, if you think about it, humans didn't always have the luxury of light pollution or artificial illumination. The night, once it arrived, was often a time of near total darkness, where the human body could naturally follow the rhythms of the sun and moon. The practice of waking in the middle of the night might have been a reflection of this more natural cycle of light and dark. As we ease into the second sleep with a sense of comfort, it's worth considering how our modern sleep cycles have changed so drastically from these medieval rhythms. We are no longer bound to the cycles of sunrise and sunset, and instead, we structure our sleep according to work schedules, artificial light, and modern conveniences. Yet, as you drift into slumber tonight, take a moment to imagine the world that medieval people experienced in the hours between their first and second sleep. A world that was slower, quieter, and perhaps a little more attuned to the natural rhythms of the universe. As the second sleep takes hold, let's shift our gaze beyond the confines of a humble medieval cottage and imagine the streets of a bustling European town under the stillness of night. Picture a city, its cobblestone streets glistening in the moonlight, the distant hum of activity still reverberating from taverns, inns, and alehouses. But what you may not realize is that in these very streets, the concept of sleep itself was governed not just by nature, but by the bustling demands of an emerging urban environment. By the late medieval period, towns and cities were growing, and along with them came a new set of challenges when it came to rest. Unlike the more isolated rural peasants, townspeople had to adjust to the rhythms of a communal space, where neighbors shared walls, public spaces, and even workspaces. This change meant that the idea of the second sleep began to take on new forms. You might have thought of the second sleep as a peaceful moment of personal reflection. But for the townsfolk, it was often interrupted by the noise of city life. Yet, the division between first and second sleep didn't vanish. Even with the increase in city noise, the old patterns of rest remained strong in many places. You see, while the middle of the night could be filled with clattering carriages and the hurried footsteps of late-night tradesmen, the early medieval cityscape still reflected the deep rhythms of nature. This was especially true in areas where people depended on the moonlight to guide their movements. And the night was more predictable than the constant distractions of a 24/7 society. Historians still debate how much these medieval cities really affected the traditional sleep cycle. On one hand, city life created new demands on the sleep of its residents, with the noise and light pollution of growing urban centers disturbing the peaceful night. On the other hand, the rhythms of the town were still shaped by agricultural needs. Early rises for farmers, quiet hours between tradesmen. So it wasn't as though the city had completely eliminated the second sleep. Instead, it altered it, adapting it to the changing landscape. Let's zoom in a little more to a particular type of medieval worker. The night watchman. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a busy town, lantern in hand, eyes scanning the darkened streets. The night watchman's job was not only to keep an eye out for criminal activity, but also to maintain the balance of the sleep cycle in the town. With such a job, there was little time for extended rest. And the second sleep for a watchman could be a rare luxury. Yet, some reports suggest that watchmen would carry a whistle or bell to wake up the townspeople in case of emergency during these late-night hours, signaling the end of their first sleep. Historians argue about the specifics of how these night watchmen managed their own sleep cycles, especially since many were required to patrol for hours. Some believe they operated in shifts, using the time between their rounds to catch a short rest, possibly even incorporating a second sleep. Others argue that the constant responsibility made it nearly impossible for the watchmen to experience true rest during the night. Regardless, these individuals played an essential role in maintaining the rhythm of the night, ensuring that the second sleep was not disturbed by criminal activity. In addition to the watchmen, there were other figures in the medieval cityscape whose sleep habits were intertwined with the community's collective rest. Take, for example, the local bakers. Picture yourself standing outside one of the many bakeries that dotted the streets of medieval towns. The warm scent of freshly baked bread mingles with a cool night air as the bakers start their day long before sunrise, often rising during the second sleep. The bakers worked in a rhythm of their own, waking during the hours that others were just settling into the second sleep, preparing dough and starting fires for the ovens. Interestingly, this pattern of working during the night was common in several other trades, including blacksmiths and tanners, whose work required specialized skills that couldn't wait for the first light of morning. Many of these workers, though, had their own methods of balancing the first and second sleep. They would often take advantage of the quieter hours of the night, waking early for the day's work, and resting between the first and second sleep. It's fascinating to consider the communal aspect of sleep during these times. People didn't just rest for their own personal well-being, but also for the well-being of the entire community. The first and second sleep divided the night into productive, restorative segments. And while the activities might have varied, depending on whether you were a baker, a night watchman, or a farmer, the overarching rhythm remained consistent. The night was a time to regroup, reflect, and prepare for the day ahead. As you drift back to sleep yourself, think about the intricate web of activities that unfolded during the night in these medieval cities, where the line between wakefulness and sleep was never quite as clear as it is today. Historians argue that the communal nature of sleep helped to maintain order in these bustling environments. Those working during the second sleep were often considered the backbone of the medieval town. Without their quiet work, there wouldn't have been fresh bread to buy or goods ready to trade the next day. Sleep, then, was more than just a necessary bodily function. It was a social contract, one that allowed the medieval world to function as it did. Now, as we settle deeper into the second sleep, you may begin to wonder, how much of this pattern remains today? We may not rise in the middle of the night for a second round of sleep, but there are still people who work in the quiet hours of the morning, keeping the world turning while others rest. The notion of a second sleep is a fleeting one, but it speaks to something deeply human. The need for both rest and productivity, a balance that's as old as time itself. As you continue to drift deeper into your own sleep, imagine, for a moment, the medieval world at its quietest. The moon casts a pale glow over the sleeping city, the streets empty, and the only sounds are the occasional rustling of trees or the creaking of timber. But in the middle of this eerie stillness, something is happening. Something that many wouldn't even think about today. The streets are being tended to. Yes, even in the dead of night, medieval workers were going about their duties. And these tasks played an important role in the rhythm of sleep. One of the most significant contributors to this nighttime labor were the street cleaners. Now, you might be picturing a modern street sweeper with their bright, rumbling machines. But in medieval times, things were a little quieter, even quaint. The street cleaners, often small teams of workers, would sweep the streets by hand, using simple tools, brooms, buckets, and scrapers. Their job was crucial. After all, with the markets and streets bustling during the day, the night was the only time for cleaning without interrupting the flow of commerce. So, while most people were resting in their first sleep, these unsung heroes of the medieval world were working quietly, keeping the streets pristine and preparing for the next day's activity. Historians still debate whether medieval people were even aware of the full impact that their nightly work had on their own sleep cycle. Did these early morning laborers disturb the rest of the populace? Or was the rhythm of nighttime work such a common occurrence that it became part of the normal, expected sleep routine? While we'll never fully know, it's interesting to consider how such a simple task could have shaped the way people rested and worked through the centuries. But let's shift focus for a moment. While the streets of the city were being swept, the inns were waking up to their own particular set of routines. Picture this. You've just finished your first sleep, and the innkeeper is already preparing the hearth for the morning. It's still dark outside, but the soft glow from the fire is beginning to spill into the lobby, ready to welcome the first travelers of the day. Now, here's where things get interesting. Medieval innkeepers, many of whom lived in the same building as their business, had an odd relationship with sleep. They too would often take part in the first sleep, but then they would wake up during the second sleep to make sure everything was in order for the morning rush. The innkeeper's sleep wasn't really about personal rest. It was a matter of timing. Their entire livelihood depended on the arrival of travelers, who would often come in the middle of the night, needing a place to rest after a long journey. So, these business owners, while not having a solid chunk of sleep, relied on the second sleep to catch their breath, stay alert, and prepare. Their rhythm was one of vigilance and anticipation. Historians argue whether this sporadic sleep schedule helped or hindered their productivity. One thing is clear, though. This nighttime schedule allowed them to cater to their guests and keep their inn running smoothly, while still getting a few hours of precious sleep. And then, there were those who lived near the monastery. Those who shared the sacred spaces where the monks slept in shifts, in rhythm with the prayers of the church. The monks, too, had a complex relationship with sleep. Medieval monasticism, deeply intertwined with the church's rhythms, saw the concept of rest through a very spiritual lens. The Benedictine rule, for example, laid out a specific schedule for prayer and sleep. There were designated hours for prayer, and in between those hours, the monks would rest. But rest wasn't a luxury. It was part of their sacred duty. Even in the second sleep, when most people were resting, the monks might still have been on watch, praying, meditating, or singing hymns into the quiet of the night. Some historians argue that the monks' sleep patterns were unique, almost transcendental in nature. They weren't just sleeping in the way most of us would imagine. They were engaging in something more profound. For some, it was a chance to let go of the distractions of the world, to enter a meditative state where sleep and prayer blurred together. For others, it was simply part of a routine that kept their minds and bodies sharp. Regardless of the specifics, the monks' sleep cycles were often disconnected from the general populations. They were designed to align with divine schedules rather than earthly ones. But let's not get lost in the church for too long. We must return to the average medieval person, the baker, the blacksmith, the farmer, who followed a different sort of rhythm. Unlike the clergy, these people didn't have the luxury of quiet hours for deep reflection. Their lives were about keeping the wheels of commerce turning. But still, even these workers relied on the second sleep. They needed it. After a long day of physical labor, the body demanded rest. This is where the second sleep came into play. It was a vital part of maintaining their physical and mental health. Historians still argue about the relationship between sleep and work in the medieval period. Some say that the second sleep was more of a necessity, something born out of the body's natural need for rest. Others believe that the cultural expectation of rest in the middle of the night was influenced by the religious practices of the time. Still, others speculate that the second sleep was simply the result of social pressures. Everyone had to rest, and no one wanted to be left out of that universal need. Whatever the reason, one thing is clear. The medieval world had an intricate and uniquely communal relationship with sleep, one that existed in harmony with the land, work, and faith. As you slip deeper into your own rest tonight, consider how far removed we are from the rhythms of the medieval world. Modern sleep has become almost a solitary experience, unburdened by the demands of communal living and early morning work. Yet, somewhere in the back of your mind, you may feel the faint echoes of the past, where the world, even in the quietest moments of sleep, was anything but still. Imagine now, as you drift into the depths of your sleep, the peaceful slumber of a medieval person. A world where waking in the dead of night wasn't a strange event, but a natural rhythm of life. As the moonlight trickles softly through your window, you hear the occasional creak of the wooden beams above, the wind whispering through the cracks in the walls. This serene moment is disturbed only by the distant sounds of the town's watchmen, who would often patrol through the night, ensuring safety and order. But what was it like to live in such a world, where the very act of sleep was so intricately tied to society, work, and survival? The medieval world wasn't like ours, where people simply drop into bed and sleep for a solid stretch of time. For many, the act of sleeping itself was divided into two parts: the first sleep and the second sleep. Historians, as they tend to do, argue whether this practice was based on necessity or simply a cultural construct. Whatever the reason, it was a deeply ingrained tradition, one that had significant implications on how people approached their daily lives and their well-being. The first sleep typically took place shortly after dusk. People would retire early, their days having been filled with long hours of hard labor or tending to the fields. The first sleep was a time to rest the weary body, to allow it to recharge for the next day's work. This sleep often lasted between 3 and 4 hours, long enough to provide some relief, but not so long as to leave one feeling groggy upon waking. As you lie there in the dark, your body naturally settling into its own rhythm, you can almost feel the tension of a medieval laborer's life. A life marked by exhaustion, the weight of physical work, and the constant demands of survival. Imagine the exhaustion of a blacksmith, hammering away at metal all day, only to retire to a small, dimly lit room to rest. But rest didn't mean uninterrupted slumber. No, the medieval person's sleep was broken into two parts, with the second sleep acting as an essential component of the cycle. The second sleep was the moment when the world of dreams would truly begin. After the first sleep, people would awaken, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes just before dawn. It was common for people to stay awake for a brief period during this time. Some would engage in light activities, such as praying, reading, or even visiting their neighbors. It was a time for reflection, a quiet moment before the day truly began. If you were a noble, perhaps this was when you had your most private conversations, or even wrote letters. But for many, it was a time to simply rest, to lie still and let the mind drift. Historians debate the purpose of this midnight awakening. Some argue that it was simply a product of the way light worked. Before the advent of artificial lighting, the darkness of the night forced people to follow a natural rhythm dictated by the sun. The first sleep, then, was an early break, while the second sleep offered a natural return to rest before the day began again. Others suggest that this sleep cycle was a social construct, one rooted in religious practices or communal life, a time for people to bond over shared experiences of waking in the night. As you think about it, you begin to wonder how much of our own sleep patterns have changed since then. The advent of electricity, artificial lighting, and modern technologies has shifted the way we sleep today. Most people sleep in one continuous stretch, with little thought to the ancient rhythms that once governed our nights. But even so, there's something undeniably comforting about this idea of segmented sleep, of having a time during the night to reconnect with yourself, to pause and reflect before slipping back into a dream-filled rest. It wasn't just the common people who followed this pattern. Even the clergy, those living in monasteries, maintained a similar schedule. Monasteries had very structured routines for sleep and prayer. The monks, who followed the rule of Saint Benedict, would wake up in the middle of the night for prayers, even while others rested. Their sleep was not just for rest. It was a sacred act, a part of their devotion to God. Their midnight wakefulness was a time for reflection and spiritual renewal. They would rise from their beds, don their robes, and gather in the cold, quiet chapel for prayers, which lasted through the night. The idea of sleep for them was less about the body's need to rest and more about preparing the soul for the next day's labor. Imagine, for a moment, the quiet of that chapel, the soft rustle of robes, the faint hum of prayer filling the stillness. In the dark, the monks would recite their prayers in unison, their voices rising and falling in harmony. It was a rhythm that echoed throughout the entire monastery, where each person's sleep cycle was woven into the larger cycle of the community. For these monks, sleep wasn't a solitary experience. It was a shared event, one that tied them together in their devotion. And what about those who didn't have the luxury of such peaceful, orderly lives? The peasants, the workers, and the common folk, who didn't have the privilege of waking for midnight prayers or structured rest, still adhered to their own sleep cycle. Their lives, dictated by the seasons and the demands of physical labor, required rest at intervals. But what they had that the wealthy did not was the bond of community. When the second sleep arrived, their lives would briefly intersect. Neighbors would visit each other, exchanging gossip, or perhaps sharing a quiet moment in the darkness, waiting for the next day to begin. Historians still argue whether this early, segmented sleep cycle had any lasting effects on the development of society. Some believe that this dual sleep pattern was integral to maintaining community bonds, while others think that it may have simply been a response to the natural rhythms of the body. Regardless, it's clear that the medieval sleep cycle had a significant impact on both individual and social life, shaping how people interacted with each other and with their environment. As you continue your own journey into sleep tonight, consider how your rest might be shaped by ancient patterns, by rhythms that extend far beyond the modern world's constant rush. It's almost comforting to think that perhaps you're not as far removed from the past as you might think. As your mind continues to float towards the realm of dreams, let's shift our attention to something that might not have crossed your mind before: medieval Europe's nighttime rituals. These weren't the cozy rituals we think of today, like warm cups of tea or a chapter of a good book before bed. No. Medieval Europeans had their own unique practices, born out of necessity, fear, and superstition. After all, when your world is filled with threats, whether from disease, the elements, or, dare we say it, roaming beasts. Sleep wasn't just about rest. It was a time to protect yourself, your home, and your family. One of the most peculiar aspects of medieval nighttime rituals was the widespread practice of night watches. If you've ever watched a medieval movie, you might remember the image of a group of men standing in the shadows of the town square, keeping an eye out for anything suspicious. These night watches were often the responsibility of local citizens, sometimes hired, but more often than not, a part of the community's civic duty. Picture it. You're just about to settle into bed when you're called upon to patrol the streets, armed with nothing more than a lantern and a good pair of boots. The night watch was not only a method of protecting the town from criminals, but also a necessary measure against what people feared most in those days: witches, ghosts, and other supernatural entities that could strike when the town was most vulnerable. People would often employ bizarre charms and symbols, ranging from garlic cloves to sacred texts, to ward off evil spirits. Some medieval towns even believed in the concept of night witches, women who were thought to ride the air and bring misfortune upon the townsfolk. And just to add a bit more drama to the picture, let's not forget that night watches could occasionally turn into literal hunts, as the townsfolk would rally together to find any suspicious individuals or creatures that seemed out of place in the darkened streets. Historians still argue about the extent to which superstition played a role in these night watches. Was it primarily about criminal activity, or were people truly afraid of witches and other shadowy figures lurking in the night? Some suggest that these rituals served as a means to ensure the community's sense of security, while others argue that they were simply an expression of a much deeper fear that permeated medieval life. But let's not get too caught up in the shadows. Even though medieval Europeans lived in constant fear of what might be lurking beyond their sight, sleep wasn't all doom and gloom. There were, of course, more peaceful and calming rituals that helped soothe people into their second sleep. Take the art of storytelling, for example. A favorite pastime in many households was gathering around the fire to listen to stories, legends, folk tales, and, of course, religious parables that offered a sense of hope and warmth in the dark. In fact, storytelling played a crucial role in the way medieval people drifted off to sleep. Imagine, if you will, a small family huddled by the hearth, the soft glow of the fire flickering in the corner of the room. The air is thick with the scent of burning wood, and the crackling sounds create a soothing background to the tales being told. Whether it was a story about a knight's noble quest or a myth about an ancient god, these stories provided both entertainment and a sense of connection. They were a way to share knowledge, to pass down traditions, and to comfort the children as they lay in their shared beds. Historians still debate how much storytelling was intertwined with a second sleep. Was it a way to extend the first sleep, providing comfort and security before the night watch started? Or did it serve as a form of relaxation, helping the family transition from the harsh realities of the day to the soft, ephemeral nature of sleep? What's clear, though, is that storytelling had a vital place in medieval life, helping people unwind and prepare for the long hours of rest that lay ahead. But before we get too lost in the cozy tales of medieval firesides, let's return to the matter of the night watch and its real-world impact. These rituals were often deeply intertwined with local law and custom, and night patrols became more formalized as medieval towns grew. Over time, the idea of a dedicated night watch evolved into a more organized, almost bureaucratic system. Towns would set up watch schedules, and failure to participate in the watch could result in punishment. Sometimes fines, other times imprisonment. So, while you might think of these watches as quaint or outdated, they were, in many ways, one of the earliest forms of organized law enforcement. As your mind drifts deeper into sleep, consider how these nighttime customs were so ingrained in the medieval mindset. They were more than just a way to pass the time. They were a means of surviving the darkness, both literally and figuratively. There was safety in numbers, security in shared responsibility, and of course, the comfort of knowing that the town watch would have your back if the night ever got too sinister. And even if you weren't directly involved in the watch, the feeling of being part of a larger community during those eerie hours made the medieval night a little less lonely. Now imagine yourself drifting off, cocooned in the comfort of your own bed, knowing that centuries ago, people just like you were snuggled in their beds, holding tight to their stories, their rituals, and their shared belief in the safety of their community. The night may have been filled with strange and sometimes eerie customs, but it was also filled with warmth, light, and the sound of familiar voices, keeping the shadows at bay. As you slip deeper into the folds of your slumber, consider the way in which sleep itself has been viewed throughout history. Today, we think of sleep as an essential part of our daily routine, a necessary escape from the pressures of modern life. But in the past, sleep was seen not just as a time to rest, but as a portal, one that connected the waking world with a realm of dreams, spirits, and the unknown. The medieval world was rich with superstitions about sleep. It wasn't just about closing your eyes at night. It was a passage through which mystical forces might travel. Whether through vivid dreams or the simple act of closing your eyes, the line between the known world and the unknown world was thinner than we might realize. Some believed that sleep was a time when souls left their bodies, wandering freely until the moment of awakening. Others thought that sleep invited spirits into the room, whether they were benign or malevolent. The act of going to sleep wasn't something to be taken lightly, especially for those who had to navigate a world filled with danger and uncertainty. People in medieval times didn't just have to worry about the physical threats of the world, bandits, disease, or harsh weather. They also had to contend with supernatural forces. It's no surprise then that sleep became entwined with rituals and protections against the unknown. Before retiring to bed, it was common for people to perform various protective acts, each tailored to the fears of their specific community. One of the most common practices was the use of amulets and charms, objects that were believed to ward off evil spirits or bad luck. It wasn't unusual for a person to place a piece of iron, a garlic bulb, or a blessed relic beneath their pillow to keep away harmful influences. Such rituals weren't just based on superstition. They were a necessary safeguard in a world where the unseen world seemed just as real as the one in front of you. Moreover, the concept of dreams took on a different meaning in medieval society. Dreams weren't just a random product of the subconscious mind. No, they were believed to be messages from the divine, the angels, or even the devil. A bad dream could be interpreted as a sign of impending doom, while a good dream could be a glimpse of divine favor. In the Bible, the story of Joseph interpreting dreams is a well-known example of how dreams were seen as divinely significant. Many medieval people believed that dreams held profound meanings, often requiring the guidance of a priest or spiritual leader to decode. These beliefs in dreams and the power of the subconscious extended far beyond the realm of superstition. Medieval philosophers and scholars pondered the nature of dreams, exploring their significance and trying to understand the strange world between waking and sleeping. It was a liminal space, one that could either offer insight or pose a danger to the sleeper. For some, dreams were a doorway to spiritual revelations. For others, they were an omen, an indicator of things to come. And as you drift deeper into the realms of your own sleep, consider the rich tapestry of meanings that medieval minds would have attached to the act of slumber. To them, sleep wasn't just a biological necessity. It was a profound, mysterious experience, one that connected them with the divine and the supernatural. Perhaps this is why the transition into sleep was often marked with ritualistic care, as people sought to protect themselves and their loved ones from whatever may have lingered in the shadows. What might surprise you is that these medieval notions didn't die out with the advent of the Enlightenment or the rise of scientific thought. Elements of these beliefs persisted in the folklore of later centuries. And even in modern times, we still hear traces of them. Consider the superstition surrounding sleep paralysis. That eerie feeling of being awake but unable to move, often accompanied by a sense of an unseen presence in the room. While science now explains sleep paralysis as a phenomenon tied to REM sleep, the experience still carries with it the echoes of centuries-old fears. In the medieval period, sleep paralysis was often thought to be caused by an evil spirit, sometimes referred to as the night hag, sitting on the sleeper's chest, rendering them immobile. The concept of the Yai's nightmare, too, has its origins in these early fears, stemming from the idea that malevolent forces could invade the sleeper's mind, creating night terrors or frightening dreams. But as we look at these historical beliefs, it's important to remember that they were shaped by the limitations of medieval knowledge. They weren't born out of a desire to remain ignorant of the natural world. Rather, they reflected the human need to understand the mysteries of the universe. In a time when illness, death, and natural disasters were often attributed to forces beyond human control, it only made sense that sleep, the very act of surrendering oneself to the unconscious, would also be subject to supernatural forces. As you continue to sleep, take comfort in the fact that these ancient ideas, while seemingly strange to us now, were once deeply meaningful to those who lived in that era. Their sleep was as much a spiritual experience as a physical one, and they sought to protect themselves from both physical and unseen dangers. And even though we may no longer use iron or garlic as shields against malevolent spirits, there's a sense of continuity in the way we protect ourselves during the night. Whether through modern rituals of security or by simply locking our doors and closing the blinds. As you awaken from your dream, remember that the medieval world saw sleep as more than just rest. It was a moment of vulnerability, yes, but also one of potential. A time when anything could happen, when spirits could visit and dreams could change the course of one's life. And maybe, just maybe, there's a part of us that still sees sleep as that mysterious, magical space, one that connects us with something greater than ourselves. Now that you've experienced the world of medieval sleep rituals, let's take a moment to shift our attention to the homes where these bedtime customs took place. Imagine yourself stepping into a modest medieval dwelling, perhaps somewhere in a small village in England or France. The walls are made of rough-hewn timber, the floor covered with straw or rushes, and the air is thick with the smells of firewood and cooked food. The only light comes from flickering candles and the fire burning in the hearth. This was the environment where sleep took on a particular significance. A space where the dangers of both the physical and supernatural worlds were ever present. In these homes, sleep wasn't a quiet, restful retreat like we might imagine today. It was shared, often in cramped quarters. Families typically slept in one large room with everyone, parents, children, servants, gathered together in the same space, all sharing the warmth of the fire. The beds were simple, made of straw or wool, with thick blankets to fend off the chill of the night. The bedding was likely not as clean or well maintained as we might expect in modern homes. And the rooms would often be filled with the sounds of livestock in the adjoining buildings. The separation between the living and sleeping spaces was almost non-existent. Given the communal nature of medieval living, it's no surprise that the concept of privacy was drastically different from our own. People didn't have the luxury of individual bedrooms or personal spaces in the way we do today. Instead, families adapted to sharing their sleeping arrangements, often sleeping in close quarters with little regard for personal boundaries. This close-knit environment likely made it all the more important to feel a sense of security before heading to sleep. The presence of others was a reassurance, but it was also an indication of how vulnerable people were during the night. Despite this communal arrangement, there were still individual differences in how people slept. Nobility, of course, had slightly more luxurious accommodations, though these were still far from what we would consider comfortable by modern standards. Their beds were larger, draped with rich fabrics, and elevated on platforms to keep them away from drafts. But even for the wealthy, sleep was not always a peaceful experience. In many cases, it was disturbed by the same fears and anxieties that plagued the common folk. Nightmares, spiritual visits, and the threat of burglary or violence made sleep an uncertain and often uneasy experience. But perhaps the most peculiar aspect of sleep in medieval times wasn't the discomfort or the communal aspect, it was the timing. In medieval Europe, it wasn't uncommon for people to engage in something called biphasic sleep. This meant that instead of sleeping in one long stretch through the night, people would divide their sleep into two distinct periods. They would go to bed shortly after sunset, wake up in the middle of the night for an hour or so, and then return to sleep until morning. During this waking period, people might pray, read, or engage in quiet activities. Some would even visit with family members or neighbors. This split sleep schedule, though odd to us today, was perfectly normal in the medieval world. Historians still debate the exact reasons for this practice. Some suggest that it was simply due to the limitations of lighting. Without candles or artificial light, the long nights would encourage people to sleep in two shifts. Others argue that it had a deeper, more spiritual significance. For many, the first sleep was a time to rest the body, while the second sleep allowed for reflection, prayer, and contemplation. This quiet time in the middle of the night was often considered a sacred period, where the world seemed to slow down, and the boundaries between the living and the spiritual realms were most porous. And while we may find this biphasic pattern unusual, it wasn't until the Industrial Revolution and the advent of artificial lighting that a more standardized, uninterrupted sleep schedule became the norm. Before the widespread use of electric lights, most people simply followed the natural rhythm of the day and night, waking up when it was still dark, and returning to sleep after a few hours. It's only in the modern world, with our reliance on electric lights, clocks, and a 24-hour society, that we've come to view a single, continuous sleep period as the only acceptable form of rest. But let's return to that medieval bedroom, where this unusual sleep pattern was common. Imagine the warmth of the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls, the hushed murmurs of family members still awake, and the occasional sounds of animals outside. The air would be thick with the smell of wood smoke and the faint scent of damp earth from the surrounding countryside. As you lie there in the quiet darkness, the weight of the world seems to disappear. You fall asleep, but not for long. After a few hours, you wake up. The room is still dark, but it feels different. The air is cooler, the fire is burned down to embers, and the house is quieter. You're not entirely sure whether you're awake or dreaming, but you know it's time to get up, even if only for a moment. During this middle-of-the-night wakefulness, the medieval mind would often reflect on the strange liminal space they found themselves in. It was a moment of heightened awareness, where dreams could blur into reality and where personal thoughts or visions could take on a deeper meaning. It was a time to think, to reflect, to pray, or even to visit with a neighbor or friend, as we mentioned before. There was no rush, no agenda, just a moment in the dark to connect with something greater, perhaps the divine, perhaps the unknown forces that hovered on the edges of the world. What might surprise you, however, is that this practice of biphasic sleep wasn't isolated to medieval Europe. Similar patterns of divided sleep have been observed in many cultures around the world, both before and after the medieval period. In ancient civilizations, from Egypt to China, it was not uncommon for people to sleep in 2 stages. Even today, certain rural cultures in parts of the world still follow a similar sleep schedule, taking advantage of the natural rhythm of day and night. In a way, our modern, continuous sleep habits are a relatively recent development, an outgrowth of the Industrial Revolution and the rise of artificial lighting. But the medieval practice of biphasic sleep is a reminder that the way we sleep is not universal. It's shaped by our environment, our technology, and our cultural attitudes. So the next time you find yourself waking up in the middle of the night, perhaps it's worth reflecting on the ancient practices of sleep that once shaped the way we rest. And who knows, maybe you'll even find a little peace in the stillness of that sacred moment between dreams and reality. As you settle back into the warmth of your bed after that brief awakening in the middle of the night, it's important to understand that the idea of sleep in the medieval world wasn't just about resting your body. It was a time of spiritual and emotional reckoning, a space where the boundaries between the physical and supernatural were blurred. But it wasn't just the odd sleep patterns that made medieval slumber so unique. The night was also filled with superstitions and rituals aimed at protecting individuals from the dangers that lurked in the darkness. Many medieval people believed that the night was a time when evil forces, spirits, and even witches roamed freely. These forces were thought to be especially active during the hours between the 2 sleeps. To counter this, people often employed various charms, prayers, and protective measures to ward off the malevolent spirits that could cause harm. Some of the most popular practices involve the use of amulets or holy symbols. People would hang blessed objects above their beds, such as crosses or small pouches containing herbs, thought to have protective qualities. And let's not forget about the role of faith in all of this. For medieval Christians, the nighttime hours were a time for prayer. And many believed that reciting certain prayers before bed could shield them from supernatural harm. One popular prayer was the Compline, a prayer said before retiring for the night. It was designed to offer a sense of peace and protection, both physical and spiritual. As the individual prepared for sleep, many people would even sleep with a Bible or prayer book under their pillow, believing it to provide them with divine protection through the night. Historians still argue whether these superstitions were simply psychological comfort, or whether they were grounded in real-world beliefs about the supernatural. Some scholars believe that these rituals were born out of a collective fear of the unknown, as medieval people had little understanding of natural phenomena like illness or bad weather. Others argue that these beliefs had deep spiritual roots, tied to a worldview that saw the world as populated by both angels and demons, with an ever-present struggle between good and evil. This spiritual approach to sleep was common in other parts of the world as well. In ancient Egypt, for example, people would place protective charms near their beds to keep away evil spirits, while in ancient Rome, certain gods were invoked before sleep to ensure a restful and safe night. In the medieval period, this idea of the spiritual realm also extended to dreams, which were considered to be powerful omens or messages from God. Imagine lying there in the darkness of your medieval room, knowing that unseen forces might be circling around you. The feeling of vulnerability would be palpable. After all, even the most comfortable of medieval beds couldn't protect you from what might be lurking beyond the veil of sleep. To make matters more mysterious, many medieval people believed that the moment between sleeping and waking was the perfect time for spirits to communicate with the living. This thin veil between dreams and reality was seen as a time when the supernatural world was closest to the human one. But these fears weren't just about malevolent spirits. There were also fears about physical dangers, such as thieves or wild animals. For those who lived on the fringes of society, the night was a dangerous time when the world outside your door could become unpredictable. To protect themselves from these threats, medieval people would often sleep with weapons nearby. Knives, swords, or even crossbows were sometimes kept within arm's reach. While the wealthy might have had guards and strong locks on their doors, the common folk didn't have the same luxury. They relied on their wits, their faith, and their own sense of readiness to survive the night. Even more curious were the medieval beliefs about what could happen if you failed to properly prepare for sleep. For example, many believed that failing to say prayers before bed could invite misfortune, illness, or even death. There were also countless superstitions surrounding the act of falling asleep itself. One common belief was that if you slept facing a certain direction, such as north, you would invite bad luck. Others believed that sleeping with your feet facing the door was a sign that death was near, as it mimicked the position of the body when it was prepared for burial. In these moments of pre-sleep ritual, you could almost feel the weight of centuries of tradition pressing down on the air around you. The same fears, the same rituals, and the same beliefs were shared across much of medieval Europe. It's as though the night was a universal experience, one that transcended time and place, weaving a shared narrative of spiritual and physical survival. Now, let's think about the role of dreams in this world. Dreams were not just seen as random neural firings or subconscious thoughts. They were believed to be messages from God, omens of the future, or even the result of divine intervention. If you dreamed of a loved one who had passed away, it was often interpreted as a sign that they were trying to communicate with you from the afterlife. Dreaming of strange symbols, animals, or otherworldly landscapes could be interpreted by clergy, who would offer advice on the meaning of these visions. It wasn't uncommon for people to ask religious leaders to interpret their dreams, and the interpretation of dreams was considered a valuable and sacred art. But there was another side to medieval dreams: nightmares. Nightmares were particularly feared because they were seen as the product of evil spirits or witches. If you woke from a nightmare, it was believed that you had been visited by a malevolent force. And it was common to say a prayer or engage in protective rituals to cleanse yourself of the bad energy. There were even specific remedies for night terrors, like sprinkling holy water on your bed or sleeping with a piece of bread under your pillow. It's fascinating how intertwined sleep, spirituality, and superstition were during this time, making it impossible to separate the physical act of sleeping from the metaphysical concerns that pervaded medieval life. Historians continue to explore the impact of these beliefs on sleep and dreams. Some argue that these superstitions played a role in shaping medieval culture, influencing everything from art to social structures. Others suggest that these beliefs were a form of psychological coping, a way to deal with the immense uncertainties and dangers of medieval life. Whatever the case, the medieval approach to sleep and dreams reveals a world where the boundaries between the mundane and the supernatural were always shifting, and where every moment of rest held the potential for something both extraordinary and unsettling. Now let's talk about one of the most peculiar aspects of medieval sleep culture: the sleeping arrangements. Picture this. It's a cold night in a stone-walled castle or a modest thatched roof cottage, and you're preparing for bed. The concept of personal space wasn't quite as we know it today. Beds were often shared, not just by couples or families, but by entire households, and sometimes even by animals. In a time where warmth was precious and the harsh winter winds could freeze you in your sleep, the communal bed was a necessity. The big bed was often the center of the household's warmth, where everyone gathered under layers of heavy woolen blankets. This wasn't just for comfort. It was a matter of survival. The heat from multiple bodies could keep the cold at bay, especially in drafty castles or stone homes where central heating was an absolute luxury. Families might sleep together, often with children, servants, and even animals like dogs or cats sharing the same space. But the whole idea of this togetherness during sleep wasn't just practical, it was cultural. In the medieval world, the concept of privacy was very different from today. Public and private spheres were far more intertwined. You'd have no choice but to endure the sounds, smells, and the occasional bumping elbows of your fellow sleepers. And that's before we even get into the discomforts of medieval mattresses, often just straw or wool stuffed into sacks. Anything but soft and fluffy, like today's mattresses. Some even say the rich had better sleep setups. Though still communal, they might have fancier linens and feather mattresses, though these were still rather lumpy by today's standards. Some castles had sleeping chambers that, while perhaps more private than the communal beds, still involved family members and servants sharing the space. Privacy in the modern sense didn't really exist for the majority of people. If you were lucky enough to have a bed to yourself, it would have been considered a rare luxury. But even then, you'd sleep under several layers of blankets, and on occasion, one layer might have been a counterpane, which wasn't necessarily for comfort, but for warmth. For the poor, however, the sleeping situation was even more precarious. Beds might not even exist, and people often slept on straw or on the bare ground with a few rags to keep warm. The wealthy might have had beds with curtains or canopies, providing at least some semblance of privacy. But it wasn't unusual for whole families or groups of workers to sleep in the same space, sometimes with a low partition separating individuals. In urban areas, especially in larger cities like London or Paris, communal sleeping spaces were common for lower-class citizens who couldn't afford the luxury of their own bed. Now, think for a moment about how all this impacted the way medieval people slept. With so many people, sometimes animals, sharing a bed or sleeping area. Sleep was not a quiet, individual activity. The sounds of snoring, shifting bodies, and the occasional sneeze or cough would have filled the air, creating a strange, almost symphonic environment. And, of course, the smell. Let's not forget that medieval hygiene was far from what we consider acceptable today. People bathed infrequently, and some nobles even used perfumes or herbs to mask body odor. The bedclothes themselves could have been rather musty, and this environment contributed to the communal and somewhat uncomfortable nature of sleep. Now, as much as you might feel a little squeamish about the lack of privacy, the idea of shared spaces was quite the norm, not just for sleeping, but for many other daily activities as well. In fact, the concept of sleeping alone would have been considered quite strange by the standards of medieval Europe. But why? Was this just a necessity, or was there something more to it? Historians still debate whether this communal sleep fostered stronger bonds within families and communities, or whether it was just a practical response to the harsh conditions of the time. In many ways, the shared bed was more than just a practical solution to the cold. It was also a space where medieval people connected. Conversations happened late into the night, and stories were passed down between generations, creating a kind of collective consciousness that tied families and communities together. It was also a place where people could receive physical affection, as intimacy wasn't confined to the privacy of one's own chamber, but was often a shared public experience. Of course, there were exceptions. Some medieval monarchs and higher aristocrats did enjoy a certain degree of sleep privacy, often with specially designed chambers or separate sleeping quarters. These nobles enjoyed more comfort in their beds, surrounded by finer materials. But even in the castles of kings and queens, servants or guards often shared the same space to keep watch over the royal family. So, while privacy was a luxury for the few, even the most powerful often lived with the awareness that their sleeping arrangements were a far cry from the personal space we now take for granted. As for the sleeping habits themselves, the pattern of 2 sleeps played a significant role in how the medieval mind processed the night. The first sleep was typically longer, and after a brief awakening, people would engage in various nighttime activities, praying, reading, or even socializing. Some accounts suggest that couples might have used this time for intimate conversation or other more personal moments, capitalizing on the quiet of the night to bond. After that, the second sleep would provide another few hours of deep rest, allowing people to wake up refreshed, ready for the new day. But here's where things get even more curious. The idea of a second sleep wasn't just something practiced in Europe. Ancient civilizations like the Romans also had a form of segmented sleep. Many scholars now believe that these two sleep periods might have been the natural human sleep cycle before artificial lighting and modern schedules disrupted our natural rhythms. Historians continue to explore whether the segmented sleep patterns of medieval people were truly healthier, or whether they were just a response to the challenges of the time, such as the lack of artificial light and the need for more security during the dark hours. As we lay here tonight, with our comfortable beds and controlled environments, it's easy to forget that sleep in the medieval world was an entirely different beast. The challenges were real, and the communal nature of it all played a significant role in shaping how medieval people viewed both sleep and the night. For them, sleep wasn't simply a solitary retreat. It was a shared experience, laden with social, spiritual, and physical significance. And as you drift off into your own sleep tonight, just remember, sometimes the biggest change isn't what we do when we're awake, but what we do when we rest. Now that we've settled into the medieval world of shared beds and cold nights, let's turn our attention to a fascinating aspect of medieval sleep that might make you rethink your own nightly routine: the role of dreams. While today, dreams are often seen as a random assortment of our subconscious thoughts, in medieval Europe, they were considered to be messages from the divine, the supernatural, or even the future. Imagine lying in your cold, shared bed, your thoughts drifting as you slip into sleep. It's not just your brain sorting through the day's events. No, for a medieval person, those dreams could be full of meaning. Dreams were taken very seriously in the Middle Ages. In fact, they were often seen as a direct communication from God or the saints, guiding the dreamer toward future events or spiritual enlightenment. If you had a vivid dream about a saint, it could be interpreted as a sign to make a pilgrimage or to begin a religious fast. On the other hand, if you dreamed of something more ominous, like an apocalyptic vision or a terrifying creature, that might be considered a warning about upcoming danger. In a world where life was often unpredictable and fraught with superstition, the idea that dreams held hidden truths would have been both comforting and unsettling. Medieval people also believed that dreams could be prophetic. There are countless accounts of kings, queens, and nobles turning to dream interpreters or religious leaders for advice on how to act based on the dreams they had the previous night. In fact, some kings even kept detailed dream journals, believing that the patterns in their dreams could offer clues to the decisions they needed to make in their reign. Whether it was the dream of a saint or the unsettling vision of a shadowy figure, dreams were taken as seriously as any waking decision. Oh, some of the most important historical events were said to have been influenced by dreams. One of the most famous cases involves King Charles VI of France, who was deeply troubled by his dreams. Charles, known as Charles the Mad, believed that his dreams were a sign of divine punishment for his misdeeds. Historians still debate whether his actions during his reign were influenced by the dreams he had during his periods of mental instability. But it's clear that he viewed his dreams as a reflection of his inner turmoil, and they certainly played a role in his decisions. Whether this was a case of mental illness or a reflection of medieval belief in the supernatural, dreams were a force to be reckoned with. Interestingly, this obsession with dreams didn't just belong to the rich and powerful. The common folk also took their dreams seriously. In rural villages, people might consult dream books, which offered interpretations of common dream symbols, like falling, flying, or encountering animals. Some of these dream books were heavily influenced by ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, while others were rooted in Christian teachings. These books often had sections that helped people understand their dreams in the context of sin and salvation, adding a layer of spiritual significance to the dreaming process. But what about the more bizarre or fantastical dreams? Medieval Europe had a wide range of beliefs when it came to the supernatural creatures that could appear in one's dreams. From dragons to witches, the line between dream and reality was blurry, to say the least. In fact, some believed that dreams could even serve as a means of communication with demons or other evil spirits. It was thought that the devil might send creatures into your dreams to tempt you or lead you astray. And many people prayed for protection against such malevolent forces during the night. One particularly interesting aspect of medieval dreams is how the church played a role in interpreting them. The church didn't just see dreams as messages from God or the devil. They also saw them as a tool for spiritual growth. Church leaders would often interpret dreams in a way that aligned with Christian doctrine, guiding individuals towards spiritual enlightenment. However, the church was also cautious about dreams. While they were viewed as potentially divine, they also cautioned against being overly obsessed with dream interpretation. Some theologians believed that focusing too much on dreams could lead people away from the true teachings of the faith, creating a dangerous reliance on the supernatural. This duality of interpretation, dreams as both a divine gift and a potential distraction, was a common theme in medieval European thought. It's fascinating to think that in a time when so much was shrouded in mystery and fear, dreams were one of the few things that seemed to offer a glimpse into the unknown. Whether seen as a guide for moral living or as a warning of future disasters, they were undeniably a big part of medieval life. Now, let's take a moment to think about what these medieval beliefs and dreams tell us about the culture of the time. In today's world, we often see dreams as an individual experience, a private journey of the mind. But for medieval Europeans, dreams were a communal affair, a shared experience where people sought answers not just within themselves, but from a higher power. And as strange as it may seem, this perspective makes perfect sense in a world where the supernatural was seen as an ever-present force in daily life. In a sense, your dreams weren't just yours alone. They were part of a larger narrative, one that intertwined the physical and the spiritual realms. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly believed in the prophetic power of dreams, or if these beliefs were more of a coping mechanism in a world filled with uncertainty and fear. Perhaps dreams, with their hidden meanings and mysterious imagery, were a way for people to feel some sense of control over a world that often seemed uncontrollable. Whether viewed as a tool for spiritual growth or a method of divine guidance, dreams in medieval Europe were far more than just a strange quirk of sleep. They were a critical part of the way people interacted with the world around them, shaping everything from personal decisions to political power. And tonight, as you close your eyes and drift off to sleep, it's easy to imagine that somewhere deep in your mind, the world of dreams awaits, just as it did for the medieval soul. What messages might your dreams bring? What guidance or warning will they offer? It's a mystery that, like in the past, might not be so easily unraveled. As you continue sinking into your soft pillow, drifting closer to sleep, let's turn our attention to one of the more peculiar features of medieval life: the nocturnal rituals and practices that would often accompany the night. In a time when the dark hours could feel long and filled with dread, many people took certain steps before bed to ensure safety and spiritual protection. The medieval night was a time of both mystery and danger, and many rituals centered around ensuring one could sleep without the threat of evil spirits or nightmares. In medieval Europe, the night was viewed with a blend of fear and reverence. After all, the world was a dark and unpredictable place, especially after the sun dipped below the horizon. People believed that the night was when demons, witches, and other sinister forces were most active. The idea of night terrors wasn't just a passing sensation, but a deeply ingrained belief that evil spirits could invade your sleep and cause harm to your body or soul. It's hard to imagine today in our world of nightlights and street lamps. But for medieval people, the night was a time of vulnerability. This is where some fascinating pre-bedtime rituals come into play. For instance, many people would place religious symbols, such as crosses or holy water, near their beds. Others would say prayers before sleeping, asking for divine protection from any harmful spirits that might be lurking in the dark. Some even wore amulets or charms, small objects believed to carry spiritual power, as a safeguard against evil. These protective rituals weren't just superstitions. They were an essential part of daily life, helping to provide comfort and a sense of control over the unknown. But what about the more elaborate practices? One of the strangest rituals associated with medieval sleep had to do with the use of night jars. These were essentially small vessels, often made of ceramic, that people would place beside their beds. The idea behind night jars was that they would capture any evil spirits that might enter the room during the night. The jars were thought to contain the spirits, preventing them from causing any harm to the sleeper. While these jars might seem like relics of a superstitious past, the belief in their power was very real at the time. In fact, some night jars were so elaborately decorated that they seemed more like fine works of art than mere tools of protection. Interestingly, historians still debate whether these rituals were primarily born from superstition or if they reflected a deeper cultural need for security. The medieval period was rife with diseases, invasions, and famines, and life was often fragile and uncertain. For many people, these nightly rituals might have offered a sense of comfort and control in a world where so much was beyond their understanding. The act of saying a prayer or placing a holy object near the bed created a feeling of agency, even if the outcome wasn't guaranteed. In a sense, these practices were a form of psychological reassurance, a way to cope with the fear and anxiety that nightfall brought. But it wasn't just spirits and demons that medieval people had to worry about when it came to the night. The medieval world was also a dangerous place because of its relative lack of hygiene and medical knowledge. It's hard to imagine, but medieval people often believed that certain physical ailments could be exacerbated by the night itself. For example, some believed that sleeping in certain positions or at certain times of the night could cause nightmares or illnesses. If you weren't careful, your body could become vulnerable to both physical and spiritual afflictions. To counter this, people devised all sorts of odd bedtime practices. They might sleep with their feet facing a door, believing that it allowed for better spiritual protection. Others believed that certain fabrics or materials, like silk, were particularly good at warding off evil during the night. And it wasn't just about protection from spirits. These rituals were also about staying healthy in a world where health was unpredictable and often beyond one's control. There was also a peculiar emphasis on the importance of the bed itself. For many, A good bed was a symbol of both physical comfort and spiritual well-being. The poor, of course, had no such luxuries. But for the wealthy, the bed was often a place where spiritual rituals were performed. Some would even sleep with sacred objects, like relics of saints or pieces of the true cross, nestled beneath their pillows. The idea was that these objects would absorb the negative energy of the night and protect the sleeper from harm. You can almost picture the opulence of the medieval bedroom. The heavy tapestries, the gilded furniture, and the sacred objects scattered across the room, creating a safe and serene space for sleep. Even more fascinating was the idea that sleep itself could be a spiritual act. To sleep well was to rest in divine favor. And many medieval people believed that their sleep quality was a direct reflection of their spiritual health. If someone had troubled dreams or woke up feeling unrested, it was often interpreted as a sign that they needed to pray more, or perhaps confess their sins. Sleep wasn't just about recharging the body. It was about maintaining harmony between the body and the soul. As the night wore on, and the medieval person settled into bed with their prayers and amulets, they might find that the dark hours weren't as frightening as they seemed. With each passing moment, sleep would begin to take over, lulling them into a state of rest. But whether they were dreaming of saints or of something more sinister, it was clear that the medieval night was far from ordinary. It was a time of spiritual reflection, a time when the veil between the physical world and the divine felt particularly thin. And as you drift off to sleep tonight, you might find yourself wondering, are we really so different from those medieval dreamers? Perhaps our own nightly rituals and routines are not so far removed from theirs, after all. As the night deepens and the warmth of your bed cradles you into a more relaxed state, let's continue exploring the medieval mind and its relationship with sleep. It might surprise you to know that the medieval approach to sleep wasn't simply about defending oneself from evil spirits. In fact, for many, sleep was a crucial aspect of their daily routine and even their societal status. What might have looked like simple bedtime habits to us were actually deeply embedded in the social fabric and the religious and philosophical beliefs of the time. One of the most striking differences between medieval sleep and modern sleep was the concept of biphasic sleep. While most of us today try to sleep in one long stretch through the night, medieval people often slept in two distinct phases. They would sleep for a few hours after sunset, waking up in the middle of the night to engage in various activities before going back to bed for a second sleep. This middle-of-the-night wakefulness was a normal part of the sleep cycle, and it was often used for prayer, reflection, or even socializing. Can you imagine waking up at 2 a.m. and simply getting up to chat with your family or neighbors over a candlelit table? It wasn't unusual back then. Historians still debate whether biphasic sleep was practiced everywhere, or if it was more prevalent in certain areas. Some suggest that the practice was more common in rural areas where there was little to do once the sun went down. Others believe that it was linked to the religious practices of the time. In fact, many people would use the first waking period to say prayers or read scriptures. This nighttime ritual, known as the watch, would be seen as a kind of spiritual renewal, a time to reconnect with the divine before going back to sleep for the second phase of rest. In a way, this pattern of biphasic sleep was a reflection of the medieval mindset. The days were busy, filled with work, religious duties, and social obligations. But the nights, especially the middle of the night, were seen as a more sacred time, when the distractions of the day could be set aside in favor of deeper contemplation and spiritual connection. And it wasn't just about prayer. Some medieval people used their waking hours for more practical activities, such as mending clothes, attending to sick relatives, or even having intimate conversations. The flexibility of this midnight interlude gave people a chance to balance their earthly responsibilities with their spiritual needs, all while still honoring the natural rhythms of their bodies. What's more, this idea of a segmented sleep cycle wasn't unique to the Middle Ages. Historians have found evidence of biphasic sleep in other cultures throughout history, such as in ancient Greece and among indigenous peoples. This natural segmentation of sleep seems to have been the norm before the widespread advent of artificial lighting and modern work schedules, which forced us into the more rigid 8-hour stretch of sleep that most of us are familiar with today. Imagine how different our lives might be if we still adopted the medieval approach to sleep. Perhaps we'd feel more connected to our natural circadian rhythms, with 2 distinct opportunities to rest and reflect. But not everyone had the luxury of waking up in the middle of the night to pray or have a leisurely chat. For the working poor in medieval Europe, sleep was often a matter of exhaustion rather than choice. These individuals would crash into bed as soon as possible, only to be jolted awake by the sound of a rooster crowing or the light of dawn creeping through a window. In some cases, sleep was a luxury that only the wealthy could afford to enjoy in a relaxed manner. For peasants and laborers, it was often a rushed affair, with little time for contemplation or comfort. This divide between the rich and the poor extended into the world of medieval bedding as well. The wealthy slept on large plush feather beds, which were filled with down feathers and sometimes even velvet. Their beds were surrounded by heavy tapestries and curtains, offering a sense of privacy and protection from the outside world. On the other hand, the poor slept on simple straw mattresses, which were far from comfortable, often causing aches and pains that only exacerbated their struggles. The contrast between these 2 types of sleep can be stark, but it also reveals a lot about the social structure of medieval Europe. Sleep, like so many other aspects of life, was something that was dictated by one's social standing. Even within the wealthier classes, there was a clear distinction between the different levels of comfort one could achieve while sleeping. Nobles, for example, had beds that were not just for sleeping, but also for entertaining. It wasn't uncommon for guests to be received in the chambers of their hosts, where they would be offered a place to rest, often right in the same bed. This practice, known as sleeping in state, was a demonstration of both power and hospitality. To sleep in the same bed as a noble was a sign of privilege, but it was also a way to secure favor and forge closer relationships with those in positions of power. It's hard to imagine, but these shared sleeping arrangements were an integral part of medieval diplomacy and courtly life. Interestingly, many historians argue that the concept of shared sleeping spaces in noble courts might have even contributed to the growth of certain medieval traditions. For example, the concept of the courtly love tradition, where knights would seek to win the favor of noble women, often played out in the context of these shared intimate spaces. The idea of sleeping in the same bed, even if just for a moment, carried with it all sorts of social and emotional connotations. It was a space where love, loyalty, and even political allegiance could be tested. As we continue to ease into the calming embrace of sleep, consider how different medieval sleep practices were shaped by societal needs and beliefs. The medieval world, with all its rituals and customs, might seem far removed from our modern experiences of bedtime. But at its core, the need for rest and protection was just as important then as it is now. Whether they're through prayer, shared space, or simply the comfort of a good bed, The act of sleep was a deeply spiritual and social experience for medieval people. And as you continue to drift deeper into rest, let the peacefulness of this history wash over you. The medieval concept of time was very different from the one we rely on today. Our understanding of the 24-hour day, punctuated by clocks and digital alarms, would have seemed foreign to those living in the Middle Ages. Instead of structured, rigid hours, the medieval mindset revolved around more fluid, natural markers of time. The cycles of the sun, the moon, and the changing seasons were the primary guides for when to work, pray, and yes, when to sleep. This unstructured approach to time was reflected in their sleeping patterns, rather than adhering to the 9-to-5 workday we associate with modern life. Medieval people would organize their lives around more organic rhythms. The day began with the first light of dawn, and the night fell when the sun disappeared below the horizon. The time in between was filled with work, prayers, meals, and rest, often dictated by the position of the sun or the sound of bells marking the time for certain rituals. So, when you're comfortably nestled in your bed tonight, remember that the medieval way of life didn't involve the precision we're accustomed to. People relied more on what the world around them told them: daylight, seasons, and the sounds of nature. In fact, the medieval approach to time can be seen as having a profound effect on how people experienced sleep. Since there were no electric lights, there was no artificial way to extend the day into the night. Once it became dark, there were fewer distractions and less work to be done. People were more inclined to go to bed at sundown. And with so many nighttime activities centered around religious devotion, sleep was often viewed not just as physical rest, but as a form of spiritual renewal. There wasn't the expectation of constant productivity, so a good night's sleep was seen as something to be cherished. But, despite the lack of modern technology, the Middle Ages were not without their own unique methods of staying awake, especially for those who needed to. Whether it was merchants trying to finish a transaction or monks completing their late-night vigils, certain substances were consumed to help stave off sleep. It's amusing to think that medieval energy drinks were quite different from the sugary, caffeine-packed beverages we enjoy today. One popular stimulant during the medieval period was alcohol, particularly wine and ale. Unlike the high-octane energy shots of today, alcohol in moderation was a staple of the medieval diet, and it often played a role in helping people stay awake during long nights of work or prayer. In fact, monks, who followed strict schedules of prayer at all hours of the day and night, were known to drink small amounts of beer or wine to help maintain their energy through their nighttime vigils. No modern energy drink could quite compare to the soothing comfort of a good mug of ale, especially during a chilly medieval night. Historians still argue over the exact amount of alcohol medieval people consumed, with some suggesting that it was more of a necessity than a luxury. Water, often contaminated and unsafe to drink, made alcohol a safer alternative. Monks and peasants alike relied on it to stay hydrated and awake during the nighttime hours. In fact, some modern researchers have found that the consumption of alcohol in the Middle Ages, especially during sleep rituals, might have had beneficial side effects for rest. The mild intoxication that accompanied the consumption of wine or beer could have helped people relax enough to fall into a deeper, more restorative sleep, particularly during times when insomnia might have been more common due to stress or spiritual concern. Speaking of stress, we also have to address the role of medieval remedies for sleep-related issues. While we have an endless supply of over-the-counter sleeping pills or herbal teas today, medieval people didn't have that luxury. Instead, they turned to nature and their faith to help alleviate any sleep troubles they might face. One common remedy involved the use of lavender, a herb that was believed to help soothe the nervous system and promote a deep, calming sleep. Lavender, with its fragrant, soothing aroma, would often be placed under pillows or woven into bed linens to enhance sleep quality. Some medieval people also believed that the scent of lavender could ward off evil spirits, ensuring that the sleeper had a peaceful and uninterrupted night. Herbal remedies weren't the only solution for sleep disturbances. Religious figures and clergy often prescribed prayers, blessings, and rituals as part of the sleep regimen. In a world where the threat of spiritual unrest or nightmares was very real, turning to the divine for protection was a natural step. People believed that having a holy relic under their pillow, like a small cross or a blessed token, could guard against the terrors of the night. These spiritual elements, woven into the fabric of daily life, provided a sense of comfort and safety during the hours of sleep. In this sense, sleep was far more than a biological need. It was an act of faith, and yet, despite all these practices, sleep wasn't always easy to come by. For the sick or elderly, rest could be elusive. Medieval people were all too familiar with the struggle of being unable to sleep, as many illnesses or age-related conditions could lead to insomnia. While the remedies of herbs, alcohol, and prayers were commonly used, they weren't always effective. This left many people to endure long, sleepless nights, sometimes filled with the dread of what the morning would bring. Imagine the vulnerability one must have felt lying awake in the middle of the night, with only the distant sound of church bells and the flicker of a candle to keep them company. It's a thought that stirs a sense of empathy, an awareness of how, in many ways, the fears of the medieval world were not so different from our own. For those who could sleep, however, the experience was often accompanied by a sense of deep peace. The medieval understanding of sleep, shaped by both religious devotion and practical need, framed the act of resting as something far greater than simply recharging the body. Sleep was a sacred time, a time when the soul could rest, rejuvenate, and be free from the weight of the day's burdens. As you lie there now, drifting ever closer to sleep yourself, remember that this tradition of peaceful, sacred rest stretches all the way back to medieval times. And who knows, maybe tonight you'll find yourself slipping into a deeper, more restful sleep, just like they did. As you begin to feel your body sink deeper into the bed, let's travel back further into history, to the time of medieval knights and their peculiar sleep customs. The medieval period, much like the Middle Ages, was a time when people believed their dreams could carry messages from beyond. So much of medieval culture was deeply influenced by religion, superstition, and the natural world. And these beliefs directly influenced how people rested at night. It wasn't just about getting a good night's sleep. Many believed that sleep could be a portal to the divine or a warning from the spirits. For instance, medieval people often associated dreams with the afterlife. So dreams weren't simply the product of a wandering mind, as we may think today. They were considered a way for the soul to connect with God, angels, or even deceased loved ones. If you had a dream about a long-lost relative or a spiritual figure, it was thought that this was a form of divine communication. Some medieval people would even consult with priests, who were believed to have the ability to interpret dreams. A vivid dream of a departed loved one could be seen as a sign that they were watching over the sleeper, guiding them through the hardships of life. But not all dreams were comforting. Some were ominous, terrifying even, and were seen as warnings. These nightmares were believed to be messages from the devil or other dark forces. A person waking from a nightmare in medieval times might not simply be frightened. They might also feel as though their soul was at risk. This belief stemmed from the medieval understanding of the world as a place full of invisible forces, both good and evil, constantly at play. And so, a bad dream could cause as much anxiety as any waking fear. Imagine being unable to shake the sense that something dark was closing in, not just in your mind, but spiritually as well. Yet, despite these ominous interpretations, the medieval approach to sleep was also highly structured, as we've seen with the prayers and religious rituals that punctuated their evenings. When sleep became a necessity, it was not just about rest. It was a spiritual ritual. As you drift into sleep tonight, consider that medieval people would have done so with the same sacred attention. They weren't just lying down to get a few hours of rest. They were preparing for a journey of the soul, a process that was deeply connected to the greater cosmos. In some cases, medieval people even believed that sleeping in certain positions could impact the quality of their dreams. One common belief was that sleeping on your right side would ensure that you would have divine, peaceful dreams, while sleeping on your left side was thought to bring nightmares. It's interesting to think that something as simple as which side you chose to sleep on could affect your spiritual and mental well-being. We may not worry about which side of the bed we sleep on today, but in medieval times, it was very much a concern. Some people also took steps to guard their sleep. While today we might set alarms or use white noise to help us drift off, medieval people would turn to objects of spiritual protection. One particularly fascinating custom was the placement of protective charms under the pillow. These charms were often made from herbs, stones, or religious items that were believed to ward off evil spirits. Some people even placed small pieces of paper with prayers or Bible verses written on them under their pillows, hoping to receive divine protection while they slept. There's something undeniably comforting about the thought of these little talismans offering a sense of security. Perhaps something that we can all relate to in our own way. There was also the widespread belief in sleeping saints or holy sleep as a way to achieve peace during the night. People would often light candles in front of images of saints, asking for protection and peaceful rest. The flickering light of the candle was not only a practical tool for illuminating the room, but also a symbol of divine presence. It was said that if one could fall asleep with the light of a saint's image flickering nearby, the soul would be kept safe from any nightmares or restless spirits. For the devout, sleep wasn't just a physical need. It was an act of faith, a chance to renew one's spirit as much as one's body. In the midst of all these rituals and beliefs, the act of sleep itself wasn't just a matter of physical rejuvenation. It was seen as a necessary part of a larger cosmic process. The same could be said for the daily cycles of prayer, which also had a deep connection to the rhythms of nature and the divine. For example, monks in medieval monasteries often engaged in vigils, a form of nightly prayer that stretched into the early hours of the morning. These prayers weren't simply acts of devotion. They were believed to keep the monks' souls pure and safe. So, when you think about how night hours were filled with sacred practices, it's almost as though they were preparing themselves for an otherworldly journey during the hours when most of us are fast asleep. But despite all the spiritual practices, sleep was still a natural necessity. And for those who couldn't find comfort through rituals or prayers, medieval people had a range of medicinal practices they turned to. One of the most fascinating aspects of medieval sleep remedies was the use of sleep-inducing brews. Some of these concoctions were made from natural herbs, while others incorporated the more unusual ingredients of the time. A typical medieval sleep remedy might include the calming properties of chamomile or valerian root, but there were also stranger ingredients. For example, opium, though used sparingly, was known to be included in some sleep potions. The effectiveness of these remedies varied, but they were a testament to how deeply people in the medieval world valued a good night's rest. And so, much like the customs of today, medieval people had their own ways of navigating the delicate balance between the waking world and the dream world. Sleep was never just an act of closing one's eyes. It was a spiritual journey, full of rituals, beliefs, and natural remedies, all designed to ensure that the soul found rest as much as the body. As you drift off tonight, you might want to consider how much more connected sleep was to the greater workings of the world in the past. It was never just a private, personal experience. It was shared by all who lived in those times. The same quiet darkness that envelops you now once held the same mystery and sacredness for those long ago. Now that you've settled deeper into the rhythm of this tale, let's move from the sacred to the more mundane side of medieval sleep customs, an aspect that might surprise you. While dreams and divine protection certainly played their part, sleep itself wasn't always as peaceful or comforting as we've imagined. In fact, medieval Europeans had some truly strange ways of tackling the necessity of rest, most of which would seem utterly bizarre by today's standards. For instance, while we might think of the bed as a soft, comforting place of rest, medieval beds were hardly the cozy sanctuaries that we know today. In fact, most medieval people didn't sleep on a mattress, at least not in the way we think of one. Instead, they typically slept on a pile of straw or feathers, which was placed on a wooden or stone platform. These primitive mattresses were often not replaced regularly, so you can imagine how they would quickly become filled with dirt, bugs, and a host of other unsavory elements. This wasn't exactly the plush, hypoallergenic environment many of us now enjoy. Now, to make matters even more uncomfortable, most medieval people didn't sleep alone, even if they were married. It wasn't uncommon for entire families or even whole communities to sleep in the same room. In castles, for example, the lord and his family might sleep in a large hall, with servants, guards, and guests all sharing the space. This meant that sleep was often disturbed by noise, snoring, and, let's face it, some awkward closeness. A far cry from our modern idea of a personal space where we can retreat for some much-needed privacy. But these shared sleeping arrangements weren't just a result of overcrowding. In many medieval homes, it was practical. Keeping everyone close at night ensured security. After all, the medieval period was a time of war, plagues, and constant threat of bandits. You didn't want to be alone in your own bed when danger could come knocking at any moment. So, families would often sleep in a kind of protective huddle, keeping themselves close together for warmth and safety. As bizarre as it may sound, this group sleeping was a necessary part of survival. But it's not just the who that makes medieval sleep customs strange. It's also the when. While today, many of us are accustomed to a solid block of sleep during the night, medieval Europeans had a much different approach. Rather than sleeping for a straight 8 hours, it was common for people to engage in something called segmented sleep. This meant that they would sleep for 2 distinct periods, with a wakeful period in between. For instance, a typical night might begin with one long sleep period from around sunset until midnight. Then, people would wake up and engage in various activities. Talking, praying, reading, or even visiting neighbors. This wakeful period, which could last anywhere from 1 to 3 hours, was actually considered a normal part of the night. It was seen as an opportunity for reflection, relaxation, and even social interaction. In fact, medieval people sometimes used this time to do things we might consider strange for the nighttime, like making repairs to their home or performing minor chores. After this interlude, they would then return to bed for their second sleep period, which would last until dawn. This split sleep cycle was thought to be healthier, as it allowed for a natural interruption in the sleeping hours. It was during this time that many people would engage in prayer or meditative reflection, considering it a spiritual time between one's waking hours and the peaceful rest of the second sleep. Historians still debate the exact reasons behind this segmented sleep pattern. Some argue it was simply a product of medieval life, with its lack of artificial lighting and the need for multiple periods of rest. Others suggest it had a deeper, almost ritualistic aspect to it. Perhaps medieval people saw their sleep as more connected to the rhythms of the natural world, taking inspiration from the moon, the stars, and the ever-changing seasons. Interestingly, this segmented sleep didn't only occur in the medieval period. It continued well into the early modern era. And it wasn't until the advent of industrialization and the rise of artificial lighting that people began to shift towards a single, uninterrupted sleep cycle. In fact, many scholars suggest that the 8-hour sleep cycle we know today might actually be a modern construct, imposed by the work schedule and the availability of light, rather than a natural necessity. But let's pause for a moment and consider what this interrupted sleep cycle might feel like. Imagine drifting off to sleep, only to wake up in the middle of the night, staring into the darkness. But instead of reaching for your phone or mindlessly scrolling through the internet, you get up and engage in thoughtful conversation or reflection. Perhaps you even write in a journal or ponder over your dreams. For medieval people, this wakeful period was almost like a bridge between the conscious and the subconscious. A moment to reconnect with their thoughts or the world around them before slipping back into the safety of sleep. Of course, not everyone in the medieval world had the luxury of a leisurely 2-part sleep cycle. For peasants and those living in the poorer classes, sleep was often a much more practical matter, driven by necessity rather than reflection. The idea of segmented sleep was mainly a practice among the wealthier classes, who had more control over their time and their environment. For the working class, sleep was something you simply did when you could, sometimes in a haystack, sometimes under the stars, and always with the ever-present awareness that danger could strike at any moment. There's something almost poetic about the idea of these interrupted nights, about how sleep in the medieval world wasn't just a mindless escape, but a complex, ritualized process that involved spiritual reflection, social interaction, and deep connection to the natural world. It's not so different from our own restless nights today, where we may wake up in the middle of the night and lie in bed, thinking over the events of the day or pondering the mysteries of life. In a way, these medieval sleeping patterns reveal a deep understanding of the mind and body's needs, a profound awareness of the importance of rest, reflection, and the spaces between the waking and sleeping worlds. Now that you've experienced the peculiarities of medieval sleep cycles, let's look at the dark corners of the night where even deeper, stranger practices existed. There's a story in history, one you might not expect to hear about. The rather eerie medieval belief in nightmares and the supernatural forces that were thought to cause them. And no, it's not just that they believed demons were lurking under the bed, though some did. Medieval people had a fascinating and quite terrifying world view when it came to what happened while they slept. To start, let's talk about the incubus and succubus. Not your average fantasy creatures, but rather terrifying figures in medieval lore. The incubus was said to be a male demon that would visit women during the night, usually while they were sleeping, and lie upon them, often with the intention of seducing or even raping them. On the flip side, the succubus was its female counterpart, preying upon men in a similar nightmarish fashion. These figures were often blamed for what we now know as sleep paralysis, that terrifying experience where you wake up but can't move, sometimes feeling as though a heavy weight is pressing down on your chest. You might also experience hallucinations of dark figures, shadows, or sinister entities watching you. Historically speaking, these were deeply ingrained superstitions, but they had real consequences for people's lives. Medieval women were sometimes accused of being visited by an incubus after experiencing a difficult or unexplainable pregnancy or illness. Some believed these supernatural entities were a form of punishment, sent by God or the devil, depending on who you asked. So imagine for a moment, a woman in medieval Europe waking up in the middle of the night after having one of these terrifying experiences, not understanding that what she was dealing with was likely a natural phenomenon, like sleep paralysis. To her, it was much more than that. It was a mark of demonic or divine intervention. But it wasn't just the demons lurking in the shadows. Night terrors, or bad dreams, were also seen as powerful omens. Medieval people believed that dreams had direct messages for them, often related to their spiritual well-being or their future fate. If you dreamed of an angel, it might mean divine intervention. But if you dreamed of the devil, it was a warning to repent or face punishment. The boundaries between the real world and the dream world were much thinner in the medieval mind. Historians still argue whether medieval beliefs in these supernatural phenomena were a form of societal control, rooted in a religious culture that sought to exert power over people's very bodies and minds, or if they were simply a reflection of the era's fears and struggles in a world that was often chaotic and unforgiving. What we know for sure is that the belief in nightmares, demons, and dreams played a role in shaping how people lived their daily lives. Consider, too, the role of sleeping charms and amulets in medieval culture. For many, sleep wasn't just about resting. It was a spiritual battleground. People wore or placed items under their pillows to ward off the supernatural, hoping to avoid nightmares or bad dreams. These objects ranged from simple charms to complex rituals designed to protect the sleeper from evil forces. You might find a small carved figure of St. Christopher under someone's pillow, or a piece of Holy Scripture tucked into the corner of a bed. The idea was that these objects would protect the sleeper from harmful dreams or spirits. For the deeply religious, having a Bible near their bed was one of the strongest ways to keep the devil at bay. Others turned to the ancient practice of incantations to help them sleep peacefully. But this doesn't just point to a mystical worldview. It also reveals a very real fear of the unknown. And for medieval people, sleep was one of the most mysterious and potentially dangerous states to be in. The night was seen as a time of vulnerability, a time when you were most open to forces beyond your control. and this belief was widespread. Even kings, nobles, and clergy had their own ways of trying to protect themselves from the unseen dangers of the night. Now, what's even more fascinating is that these beliefs weren't universally shared. In some parts of Europe, particularly in the north, there were entirely different conceptions of the supernatural world's influence over sleep. Instead of demons and devils, the Norse believed in the presence of spirits and elves who could either cause nightmares or help bring peaceful sleep. These belief systems weren't just fanciful tales. They were taken seriously. And often, people would make offerings to these spirits to ensure they slept soundly. Interestingly, not all nightmares were considered bad omens in every medieval culture. In some cases, nightmares could be seen as prophetic, with dreams believed to provide the sleeper with vital information about the future. A bad dream might be a sign that you needed to change your course in life. On the other hand, a pleasant dream might be seen as an affirmation that you were on the right path. People took these dreams very seriously, often consulting with dream interpreters to gain insight into their future and spiritual health. Historians and psychologists today often look back at these medieval practices with a sense of intrigue. Could it be that our modern understanding of sleep disorders and nightmares has its roots in these ancient beliefs? Did the experience of sleep paralysis, what we now know to be a natural occurrence, serve as the foundation for an entire mythology of demons and spirits? Maybe. Or maybe medieval people simply didn't have the scientific knowledge we possess today, so they filled the gaps with the supernatural. But no matter how you slice it, these beliefs reveal just how closely sleep and spiritual health were intertwined in the medieval world. As we look back at this era, one thing becomes clear. The medieval worldview was far more mystical and enchanted than we often give it credit for. The lines between reality and the supernatural were blurred in ways that modern minds might find difficult to comprehend. Dreams weren't just dreams. They were a form of communication, a bridge between the living and the divine, or the demonic. Now that you've seen how dreams, nightmares, and demons played their role in medieval sleep, it's time to dive into the even darker practices of the night, specifically the mysterious art of sleepwalking, an activity that seemed to hold great fascination for medieval minds. You might think of sleepwalking as a modern phenomenon, something that's easily explained away by science. But in the medieval world, sleepwalking was not just a strange occurrence. It was seen as a mystical event, full of ominous implications and deep spiritual meaning. Let's start by painting a picture. Imagine you're a medieval villager, and one of your fellow townsfolk has been observed walking around at night in a trance-like state. He's moving without apparent awareness, sometimes performing tasks like milking cows or even talking to unseen figures. To the modern eye, it's simply an involuntary action triggered by a disorder of the brain. But to a medieval mind, this was much more than a neurological glitch. A sleepwalker was believed to be possessed by spirits or under the influence of powerful forces. Sleepwalking, in some circles, was even seen as a form of divine possession, a supernatural state that allowed the individual to walk between the realms of the living and the dead. But it wasn't all about the supernatural. There were also darker, more sinister interpretations. Some medieval theologians argued that sleepwalking was a sign that someone had succumbed to sin, that their soul was so disturbed by unrepented wrongdoings that it was manifesting in their sleep. In the worst cases, a sleepwalker was seen as someone who was haunted, a person whose spiritual health had deteriorated to the point where they could no longer control their own body, let alone their dreams. In fact, there were even stories of sleepwalkers committing unspeakable acts, like attacking people or even wandering off into the wilderness, never to be seen again. It's curious to note that medieval doctors and scholars didn't have the vocabulary or understanding to explain these phenomena, so they turned to the supernatural. Some believed that sleepwalking was a sign of witchcraft. The sleepwalker was seen as a vessel for witches or demons who were using them to commit acts of magic in the dead of night. If someone was known to be a sleepwalker, it was often assumed that they were under the influence of dark forces. And in some unfortunate cases, these individuals were accused of witchcraft and put on trial. Historians still argue about the extent to which sleepwalking was understood as a supernatural phenomenon versus a medical condition in the medieval period. There's evidence to suggest that medieval doctors did attempt to explain sleepwalking in terms of bodily humors and imbalances. But these explanations were often couched in spiritual language. If someone was found to be sleepwalking, it was not uncommon for them to be treated with spiritual remedies, such as being prayed over, anointed with holy oil, or even exorcised, if it was suspected that their behavior had been caused by demonic forces. But sleepwalking wasn't the only strange nighttime behavior. In some parts of medieval Europe, it was believed that certain individuals, particularly those who had been touched by the divine or cursed by dark forces, could travel while asleep. These so-called astral projections were thought to allow the sleeper to leave their physical body and wander to far-off places, or even into the afterlife. You might hear stories of people who claim to have visited heaven or hell during their sleep, experiencing vivid visions that were interpreted as divine revelations. To many, these experiences were seen as proof of the power of the soul and the boundary between life and death. Now, sleepwalking is a far cry from the eerie concept of astral projection or dream travel, but it does serve as a glimpse into the way medieval people perceived sleep as something otherworldly. Sleep wasn't just a physical necessity. It was seen as an entry point into a parallel world, where anything was possible. The night, as far as they were concerned, was a time of magical transformation. A time when the ordinary rules of life didn't apply. And if you had the ability to travel beyond your physical body in your sleep, well, you were no longer bound by those rules. The connections between sleep and the supernatural didn't stop there. There was a belief that during sleep, people were particularly vulnerable to demonic influence. A person who slept in a certain way, such as lying on their back or in a specific position, was thought to be more susceptible to the presence of evil spirits or witches. Some accounts suggest that people even slept with charms or spells drawn onto the floors of their homes, hoping to ward off these unwanted intruders. As bizarre as it may sound to us, these beliefs were integral to medieval life. Sleep wasn't just a time of rest. It was a vulnerable state, one that could potentially open you up to all kinds of spiritual intervention, whether good or bad. Medieval people had very little understanding of what sleep was, let alone sleep disorders like sleepwalking. So they filled the gaps with superstition, constructing an elaborate web of beliefs about what could happen when the body was at rest. And these beliefs didn't just shape their perception of sleep. They also played a role in how they lived their lives during the day, influencing everything from diet to rituals, to the very way they built their homes. In the modern world, we understand sleepwalking as a disorder caused by disrupted sleep cycles, often brought on by stress, anxiety, or other environmental factors. But back then, well, in the medieval mind, sleepwalking was a portal to the unknown, a dangerous glimpse into the unseen world where demons and spirits roamed freely. For medieval people, the night was not just a time for sleep. It was a time for otherworldly encounters, a time when anything could happen. As the medieval night passed and sleep-related phenomena became more intertwined with the unseen forces, the concept of sleep as a time of spiritual reckoning only deepened. The moonlit hours were not just when the body rested. They were when the soul wandered. Among these wandering souls were those who were believed to enter a particularly dangerous realm, the dream world of the dead. This belief was pervasive across Europe during the Middle Ages, with various cultures holding to the idea that the night was a time when the boundary between life and death grew thin, allowing spirits to roam freely. To understand how this belief played into medieval sleep culture, it's helpful to consider how death was viewed in this period. Unlike our modern understanding of death as an irreversible biological event, in the medieval mind, death was often seen as a passage, not a definitive end. People believed the soul lingered long after the body had perished, and in some cases, the soul could be caught in a liminal space, unable to move on. These souls were often seen as restless spirits, roaming the earth and seeking release. What better time for them to wander than when the living were asleep, unaware of their presence? This idea formed the basis for the common belief in nocturnal visitations, which were said to happen most frequently in the dead of night. A person might wake up to find themselves unable to move, a sensation known as sleep paralysis. The body was awake, but the mind still trapped in a dreamlike state, unable to break free. In the medieval world, this experience was often associated with the visitation of evil spirits, often witches or demons, who were thought to paralyze their victims during the night, either to torment them or to steal their souls. Sleep paralysis was no simple matter in the medieval mind. It wasn't just an uncomfortable sensation. It was seen as an attack, a spiritual battle, fought while the person was most vulnerable. The paralysis was thought to be the result of a demonic presence sitting on the chest of the sleeper, slowly suffocating them. Often these attacks were believed to be the work of witches, who were accused of night riding, flying through the air at night and tormenting the unsuspecting, often causing nightmares, paralysis, and even death. There were stories of witches whose power grew stronger with each successful attack on a victim. Sleep paralysis, in this context, wasn't just a strange medical condition. It was a real, terrifying spiritual event. But it wasn't just witches and demons that were blamed for these experiences. The superstition surrounding the dead was also prominent. If you woke up to find yourself paralyzed in bed, it was sometimes thought that you had been visited by the spirit of a recently deceased relative. Perhaps a relative whose soul was still wandering, unwilling to leave the earth. These restless spirits were believed to take on a sinister role, especially if the person had not received a proper Christian burial or if their family had failed to perform the proper rites. In these cases, the spirit was thought to be seeking closure, and they might visit their loved ones during the night to remind them of their unfinished business. In medieval folklore, there were various cures and protections for sleep paralysis, many of which involved rituals designed to ward off spirits. One of the most common methods was the use of holy symbols, like crucifixes or blessed candles, which were placed near the bed or in the room to keep evil spirits at bay. In some parts of Europe, people would sleep with amulets or pieces of iron which were believed to be protective. Others would even resort to spells or incantations, prayers or chants that were said to call upon divine powers to protect the sleeper. If the spirit was particularly persistent, the person might even seek the help of a local priest or healer who would perform an exorcism or a special blessing. Historians still debate whether these experiences were truly spiritual in nature or whether they were simply the result of sleep disorders like sleep paralysis, which is known to affect many people even today. Some scholars argue that medieval people were more likely to experience these events due to the lack of understanding about the brain and sleep cycles. Others believe that the spiritual interpretations were a direct result of the period's deep religiosity and belief in the supernatural. But whether the cause was spiritual or physical, the fear of nighttime attacks was very real for medieval people. And it wasn't just the paralyzing fear of death that haunted them. There was also the lingering thought that perhaps they themselves were susceptible to becoming one of the restless souls who could never fully enter the afterlife. Imagine that. Lying in your bed, unsure whether you were simply having a nightmare or whether the dead were actually trying to reach you. So, as the medieval world grew more obsessed with sleep and its role in both the living and the dead, the fears surrounding it only became more complex. Nighttime was not just a time of rest. It was a time when the rules of life seemed to bend, a time when spirits roamed freely and the living were vulnerable. But sleep was also seen as a chance for divine communication, a time when the soul could venture beyond the physical realm, a time when visions and dreams could provide answers to the questions of the living. As the centuries passed, these beliefs gradually faded away with the rise of more scientific explanations for sleep-related phenomena. But in the medieval world, sleep was still a dangerous, mysterious force. A time when the boundaries between life and death, good and evil, were blurred. And so, as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that in the Middle Ages, the night was just as much a time of spiritual reckoning as it was for rest. Whether you're plagued by demons, visited by ancestors, or simply dreaming of far-off lands, the medieval world had a much broader understanding of sleep than we do today. Now that we've delved into the world of spirits and sleep paralysis, let's focus on another fascinating aspect of medieval sleep habits: the art of sleep itself. It's easy to imagine that medieval sleep was quite similar to modern slumber. Just people lying down, closing their eyes, and drifting into unconsciousness. But as with so many things in the Middle Ages, there was a whole different way of thinking about it, especially when it came to how long people actually slept. You might assume that people back then were just like us, seeking their full 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep. But no, the medieval concept of sleep was surprisingly different. In fact, people in the Middle Ages rarely slept through the night in one long stretch. Instead, they followed a sleeping pattern that was known as the biphasic sleep cycle. You might be familiar with the concept of napping or split sleep, but in the medieval period, it was taken to another level. Instead of going to bed at, say, 9 p.m. and waking up at 7 o'clock a.m., medieval people would typically sleep for a few hours after sunset, wake up in the middle of the night, and then sleep again until morning. This nighttime interlude between the two sleep phases was known as the watch, or midnight wakefulness, and it was a regular part of life for many people. During this time, people would engage in a variety of activities, sometimes practical, sometimes spiritual. Some would pray, meditate, or read religious texts, while others might simply talk with their spouse or reflect on their day. This intermediate period was a time when people could interact with the world outside of their dreams, which of course included the spiritual realm. Interestingly, people at this time didn't just view this middle-of-the-night period as an interruption to sleep. They saw it as an important part of the entire process. This was considered the optimal time for deep reflection, prayer, and introspection. Activities that were believed to lead to a more complete rest. Some even believed that the time spent awake at night had spiritual benefits, allowing the sleeper to come closer to God or to gain clarity on important life matters. But what happened during this time wasn't always peaceful or serene. For many, the hours between sleep phases were filled with anxieties and fears. For example, it was during this time that people were most likely to experience strange dreams or visions. The night was believed to be when portents could be seen, omens that would predict future events, some of which were welcomed, while others were frighteningly ominous. Historians still debate the significance of this second sleep in medieval culture. Some argue that it was a necessary adaptation to the lack of artificial lighting, which made long hours of uninterrupted sleep impossible in a world without electric lights. Others suggest that it was simply a cultural habit, rooted in the natural rhythms of life. What's clear, however, is that the medieval sleep cycle was much more flexible than the rigid patterns we follow today. In fact, there's evidence to suggest that people in the Middle Ages weren't just sleeping in two phases. Some studies have shown that people may have experienced a third phase of sleep too. An hour or so of light, dozing sleep just before sunrise. This brief moment was thought to be a kind of pre-dawn rest that allowed people to gain a little more energy before they began their daily work. The medieval world, with its agricultural demands and the lack of modern conveniences, relied heavily on the availability of natural sleep cycles. And these cycles didn't align perfectly with our modern understanding of sleep. But beyond the practical reasons for this sleep pattern, the cultural significance of these sleep phases can't be overlooked. Take the watch period, for instance. It was seen as a time of communion with the divine. People would often pray during these moments, believing that they were closer to heaven than at any other time of day. In fact, some monks even wrote about how they preferred this second, midnight sleep, as it gave them more time to reflect and devote themselves to God's will. This makes sense considering the spiritual emphasis of the era. People didn't just sleep to rest. They also slept to renew their faith, find divine guidance. As peculiar as this all sounds to our modern ears, there was an important reason behind this form of sleep: spiritual health. In medieval Europe, people weren't just concerned with their physical health. They also focused heavily on their spiritual well-being, and sleep was seen as an integral part of the process. In fact, sleeping was often likened to a form of prayer, something that allowed the body to rest, while the soul worked in tandem with God. These nights of split sleep gave people the opportunity to perform spiritual rituals or reflect on their actions in ways that weren't possible during the day. Despite the benefits of these nighttime rituals, medieval people still had their fair share of sleep-related challenges. For instance, one of the biggest obstacles to a good night's sleep was the environment itself. Many people slept in unheated rooms with only a thin woolen blanket for warmth. The cold, damp conditions made it difficult to sleep soundly, and the risk of illness was high. In fact, It wasn't uncommon for people to experience frequent interruptions to their sleep due to illness, nightmares, or discomfort. But perhaps the biggest challenge was the lack of privacy. Many people slept in crowded quarters, often sharing a bed with their spouse, children, and sometimes even livestock. The lack of personal space and quiet was a major source of disruption for people trying to sleep. Yet, despite these challenges, medieval people managed to adapt and find their own rhythm. The idea of multiple sleep phases may seem strange to us today, but in the context of their world, it was a perfectly natural way of adjusting to the demands of the time. The rhythms of life were centered around the natural cycles of the day, and sleep was no exception. As we think about how far we've come in terms of sleep technology and modern understanding, it's a reminder that the way we sleep today is far removed from the ways of the past. The medieval sleep cycle, with its interruptions, reflections, and devotion, is a fascinating glimpse into how the rhythms of the body, mind, and spirit were once intertwined. It's a reminder that sleep is not only a physical act, but a deeply spiritual experience. As we continue down this winding path through medieval Europe's sleep customs, we can't forget one of the most fascinating aspects of the nighttime economy, the midnight feast. You might be surprised to hear that even in the dead of night, many people were still wide awake. Perhaps not for spiritual reasons, but rather due to their hunger and the natural rhythms of their day. And yes, these feasts weren't always reserved for the elite. In fact, even peasants and common folk often took part in these late-night rituals. Medieval feasts were a much grander affair than what we might picture today. No simple dinners of soup and bread. No, these were sprawling, lavish events that often stretched into the early morning hours. The late-night meals were a key social and cultural activity, and it was during these events that bonds were strengthened, alliances formed, and important decisions made. But there's more to the story than just food. When you picture these midnight feasts, it's important to remember that they weren't just for filling bellies. They also had deep symbolic meaning. Food during the medieval period was intimately tied to social status and power. The rich and noble could afford to indulge in extravagant banquets, while peasants scraped by with whatever they could gather. And yet, these late-night meals were an egalitarian event. While the nobles may have had the finest meats and wines at their disposal, common folk still participated in the same rituals, even if their fare was humbler. Historians often point to the ritualistic nature of these feasts. It wasn't simply about satiating hunger. It was about fostering a sense of community and reaffirming the bonds of kinship, loyalty, and shared purpose. In this sense, these meals were almost a form of spiritual sustenance. The banquet could sometimes take on the form of a ritual sacrifice, particularly when a boar or a large animal was slaughtered and served. This wasn't just food. It was a symbol of prosperity, an offering to the gods, a symbol of abundance that reaffirmed the social order. But feasts weren't the only events that kept people awake at night. Remember, a medieval life wasn't structured around the modern idea of a 9-to-5 workday. The lack of artificial light made nightfall a time of unpredictable rhythm. After the day's work was done, some individuals might use the late hours to catch up on other things. Some practical, some decidedly less so. Take, for example, the so-called night watchmen, or night watchers, whose primary job was to patrol the streets after dark, ensuring that the night remained calm and that fire hazards were kept at bay. But it wasn't only their professional duties that kept them up. Many of these night watchmen often engaged in their own rituals and superstitions during their shifts. They would keep vigil, sometimes calling out "all's well" as a signal to others in the community that things were safe. But when things weren't well, these nighttime guardians were the first to respond, often armed with nothing but a club or a whistle. Their job was more than just keeping the peace. It was tied to the idea of cosmic order. Many medieval people believed that nighttime was a liminal space, where the forces of good and evil were in a constant battle for control. The watchman was the protector of the town, and in many ways, their duty was to ensure that the forces of chaos didn't spill over into the waking world. Interestingly, as part of their job, many of these night watchmen would engage in something called the night chant. This wasn't some sort of melodic hymn, but rather a repetitive, almost meditative chant that would help keep them alert and focused during the long hours of the night. It was believed that by repeating certain phrases, they could ward off evil spirits and maintain the peace of the night. This practice wasn't unique to the watchmen either. Many people across medieval Europe believed in the protective power of certain words and chants, particularly during the nighttime hours. Meanwhile, for the more affluent members of society, there was often another reason for their late-night wakefulness: luxury. The wealthy in medieval Europe, especially in larger cities like Paris, Venice, and London, would spend long hours attending entertainments that kept them awake well past midnight. These entertainments weren't your typical modern-day movies or television shows. No. They were extravagant theater performances or musical performances designed to cater to the tastes of the upper classes. The rich would gather in great halls or outdoor arenas, feasting and enjoying the evening's revelry. But these performances weren't just for pleasure. Often, they were public affairs, events that were closely tied to political and religious power. The monarch or other nobles would host these events as a way to show off their wealth and power, as well as demonstrate loyalty to the ruling powers of the day. There was an important political and cultural subtext to these festivities, and the guests who attended weren't just there for the entertainment. They were part of a system of control that kept the social order intact. Historians still debate the role of these entertainments in medieval society. Some believe that they were just a way for the upper classes to indulge in luxury, while others argue that these events were a means of solidifying political power. The lavishness of the feasts, the grandeur of the performances, and the sheer size of the gatherings suggested that they were as much about making a statement as they were about having fun. They were a performance in every sense of the word. And, of course, these entertainments wouldn't be complete without alcohol. Medieval feasts and revelries were often boisterous affairs, with ale, wine, and mead flowing freely. The idea of drinking late into the night was just as common among the peasants as it was for the nobility, and it was a key part of the social fabric. In fact, historians suggest that alcohol consumption was a common thread that helped bind people together during these late-night activities. After all, a few drinks could loosen tongues, foster camaraderie, and in some cases, fuel even more elaborate late-night rituals. While many of these events took place in grand halls or open-air arenas, it's important to remember that not everyone in medieval society had the luxury of attending such extravagant affairs. For the common people, midnight often meant a return to more modest but still social gatherings. Whether they were telling stories around a fire or making the most of their humble kitchens, the medieval commoners, too, had their own version of the midnight feast, one that kept them awake, engaged, and connected to their communities. The more we delve into these practices, the more we realize how far removed our modern society is from the rhythms of the past. Today, when we think of midnight, we often associate it with quiet solitude or sleep. But in medieval Europe, the night was a time for gathering, feasting, ritualizing, and even protecting one's home. People lived and breathed in the night as much as they did in the day, embracing the darkness rather than shying away from it. In the sprawling landscape of medieval Europe, another curious habit that often came to light during the night was the practice of night prayers. The idea of communing with the divine under the cover of darkness was a deeply ingrained custom, particularly among the monks and clergy. They didn't sleep in the same way that common folk did. In fact, their day often began before dawn and didn't end until the stars had long been in the sky. But it wasn't just the clergy that kept vigil. The general populace, too, believed that the night held unique spiritual significance. Night prayers were not only a spiritual ritual, but also a defense mechanism. People in medieval Europe were heavily influenced by the idea that the night was a time when supernatural forces were most active. Demons, evil spirits, and the forces of darkness were thought to be at their most powerful after sundown. This sense of spiritual warfare was pervasive. People would take to their knees, not just out of religious devotion, but to protect themselves, seeking divine intervention against these malevolent forces. For the monks, these midnight devotions were known as matins, the first of the 8 daily prayers that monks would recite. This midnight prayer was thought to be particularly important, for it was believed that praying at midnight brought one closer to the divine, as it was the quietest and most sacred hour of the night. In a way, the midnight prayer functioned as a kind of shield. It was a way to fend off evil, purify the soul, and prepare for the coming day. This was not an isolated practice for monks alone, though. Devout Christians would often wake in the dead of night to say prayers, especially when they were facing hardship or illness. For them, the night was both a time for rest and a time for spiritual vigilance. Historians still argue about the exact nature of these nocturnal devotions. Some scholars suggest that it was simply the early Christian church's way of marking the hours of the day, while others believe it was a response to the prevalent superstition of the time, which held that the night was an especially dangerous time for humans, full of unseen dangers lurking in the shadows. Whether spiritual or superstitious, one thing is clear. Medieval Europe's nighttime devotions were taken very seriously, and the midnight prayers were an essential component of many people's lives. And yet, despite these powerful nighttime rituals, the darkness wasn't always seen as a threat. For some, night was a time for peaceful reflection and communion with the divine. It was a quieter, more intimate hour. Some felt that the darkness brought them closer to God. Just as the sun's light could be blinding and harsh, the stillness of night brought about a sense of calm, where one could reflect and truly listen for divine guidance. This was especially true in the monasteries, where the silence of night allowed for the contemplation and personal connection to God that could be more difficult to find during the busy day. For ordinary people, The need for spiritual guidance didn't cease when the sun went down. If anything, the night was when superstitions were most likely to surface. People would sometimes carry charms, talismans, or incantations, objects or words thought to keep the night at bay, particularly if they were traveling after dark. For the peasantry, the supernatural was very much part of their daily life, and many believed that the midnight hour held a special potency for magic and miracles. If someone was ill, it wasn't uncommon for a folk healer to perform a midnight ritual in the hope of curing them, using herbs, chants, or sacred objects. These healing rituals often carried a blend of Christian and pagan influences, a testament to the syncretic nature of medieval belief. But as you know, superstition was only one side of the coin. The other side was deeply rooted in practical, everyday life. Take, for example, the craftsman, who might spend hours after sundown perfecting their craft. A blacksmith, a weaver, or a potter would often work well into the night, especially during the winter months when the days were shorter and the workday needed to be extended. These men and women relied on their craft to sustain themselves and their families, and for many, working after dark was just part of their reality. And don't forget the medieval tavern culture, where after a hard day's work, people would gather at the local tavern to share a drink and unwind. Taverns were the heart of social life in many villages and towns. For peasants, the tavern was a place to tell stories, laugh, and escape the drudgery of daily life. And, of course, tavern owners would often find themselves working through the late hours, ensuring the flow of alcohol and food continued well into the night. But what about the royalty? What were the ruling classes up to in these hours? The nobles, kings, and queens who spent their days in lavish courts and opulent castles also had their share of midnight activities. Their lives, however, weren't filled with mundane tasks like those of the peasants or artisans. Instead, the nobles often engaged in more refined pleasures. Midnight balls, for example, were a staple of the aristocratic social calendar. These late-night dances were lavish affairs, complete with the finest food, music, and entertainment money could buy. The nobility would gather to drink wine, exchange gossip, and discuss political matters, sometimes even forging alliances or making plans that could affect the entire kingdom. These aristocratic midnight events were also heavily ritualized and structured. Just as the peasants had their own customs, the nobles had their own etiquette. You can imagine how a slip-up at one of these gatherings could lead to public scandal. A misstep during a dance or an improper toast could ruin a noble's reputation for years to come. But at the same time, these midnight balls were an escape, a place where the pressures of court life and politics could momentarily be forgotten, and the individuals could simply be human. Historians still debate whether the late-night activities of the aristocracy served as a means of legitimizing their rule. Were these midnight feasts and balls a way of reinforcing their power and control? Or were they simply a form of escapism for the upper classes who lived under constant scrutiny and responsibility? Whatever the case, one thing is clear. In the world of medieval Europe, night was a time for reflection, socialization, and often survival, whether through prayer, work, or indulgence. As we move forward, let's take a step back and think about what all of this tells us. The notion that night was a time solely for rest, and sleep didn't truly apply to the people of medieval Europe. For them, the nighttime was as much a part of their culture, spirituality, and daily life as the daylight hours. And as we move deeper into this journey through the darkened corners of medieval history, you'll see just how far-reaching these nighttime habits were. Now, we move from midnight prayers and royal banquets to something a bit more peculiar: the medieval obsession with dreams and their interpretations. In the quiet of the night, as people drifted off to sleep, they were not simply resting their tired bodies. They were entering a world that was both mysterious and deeply meaningful. The medieval mind was obsessed with dreams, often believing them to be messages from the divine, or even windows into the future. Dreams were taken so seriously that many people kept dream journals, writing down every detail of their nighttime visions. These records were often shared with local priests, monks, or even scholars, who would spend hours interpreting the symbolism and meaning behind each dream. Some of the most common interpretations involved religious themes, such as visions of angels, demons, or saints. These dreams were seen as a form of divine communication, and many believed that their fates were tied to the messages they received while asleep. But not all dreams were considered divine. Nightmares and disturbing visions were often viewed as the work of malevolent spirits or demonic forces. In fact, the concept of the nightmare itself comes from the medieval belief that evil creatures, known as incubi and succubi, would visit people in their sleep, often causing terrifying dreams or even sexual attacks during the night. These creatures were thought to feed on the energy of their victims, draining them of vitality. To protect oneself, medieval people would often sleep with protective charms or amulets, hoping to ward off these supernatural intruders. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were rooted in actual sleep paralysis, or whether they were simply a cultural reflection of the medieval fascination with the supernatural. It's possible that the experience of waking up in the middle of a terrifying dream led people to interpret the sensation of paralysis as a visitation from demons. What we do know for sure is that dreams were considered far more than just random brain activity in the medieval world. They were seen as messages, warnings, and omens. In addition to the religious and supernatural interpretations, medieval dream interpretation was also heavily influenced by astrology. People believed that the positions of the stars and planets could influence not only waking life, but also the dreams one had. There were entire books dedicated to explaining how to interpret dreams based on the astrological signs at the time of sleep. For example, if someone dreamed of falling while the moon was in Aries, it was thought to be an omen of disaster. On the other hand, if someone dreamed of flying during a full moon, it could be seen as a sign of divine favor or spiritual elevation. Astrological dream books were commonly passed around in medieval courts, and many nobles had personal astrologers who would interpret their dreams before making any major decisions. For ordinary folk, dreams could be a way of predicting the future, particularly when it came to matters of love, wealth, or death. If you dreamed of a loved one passing away, it was often seen as a warning to take action, whether that meant reconciling a strained relationship or preparing for the inevitable. Similarly, if you dreamed of wealth or treasure, it was considered a sign that fortune was on its way. But the interpretation of dreams wasn't always straightforward. For every dream that predicted good fortune, there was one that foretold doom. A dream of being chased, for instance, might signal impending danger or a threat from an enemy. Interestingly, not all dream interpretations were religious or superstitious. Some scholars in the medieval period, particularly during the later years of the Renaissance, began to treat dreams as part of the natural world. They began to explore the psychological and physiological aspects of sleep. suggesting that dreams might simply be a reflection of one's subconscious thoughts or desires. But even in these early studies, dreams were still seen as a gateway to understanding the human condition. This fascination with dreams extended to medieval literature as well. Many epic poems and stories, such as those found in the Arthurian legends, featured prophetic dreams that helped guide the actions of the hero. In these tales, characters often experience vivid dreams that provide clues about future battles, relationships, or personal trials. These dreams were considered a crucial part of the narrative, offering the protagonist a chance to prepare for the challenges ahead. In a way, dreams in medieval literature were a form of foreshadowing, giving both the character and the audience insight into the path that lay before them. So, as you lie here tonight, imagine the world of medieval Europe, where dreams were not just idle fantasies of the mind, but powerful forces that shaped the lives of the people who experienced them. The medieval obsession with dreams wasn't just a passing fancy. It was a vital part of their worldview, deeply intertwined with their spirituality, their daily lives, and their understanding of fate. Historians still argue whether dreams held more significance in medieval times than they do today, or whether modern society simply views them through a different lens. Regardless, it's clear that the medieval mindset placed a unique emphasis on the nighttime realm of dreams, seeing it as a realm where the divine, the supernatural, and the self could all converge. But dreams were not the only mystical occurrences to hold sway over medieval society. As we move into the next section, we'll see how nighttime omens, visions, and sights were just as much a part of the medieval experience as the dreams people had. Stay with me, because this next part gets really fascinating.